Story number 1. The Abandoned Church's Lament. I'll never forget the night I first set foot inside that long-forgotten church. An encounter that changed everything I thought I knew about haunted places. It wasn't a well-known landmark with its name splashed across every ghost tour brochure. No, this church was hidden away on a narrow, twisting road in a quiet part of town. A place known only to those who whispered about it in hushed tones, a secret kept among the locals for generations. I had heard stories, vague and unsettling, about strange sounds echoing in its ruins. Neighbors would talk about an inexplicable chanting at night, spectral hymns that seemed to rise from the very walls, and a heavy, almost suffocating sorrow that blanketed the building. Although I was skeptical, my curiosity and the lure of a mystery I couldn't ignore pushed me to explore it one chilly autumn evening. It was late, the sky a dark canvas punctured only by distant stars. I drove slowly down a winding, unmarked road that I'd never seen on any map. There were no street signs or public records mentioning this place. It felt as if the church existed solely in whispered memories. When I finally pulled up to the overgrown lot, I was struck by its presence, a structure that, even in decay, radiated an aura of solemn dignity mixed with quiet despair. I parked my car in a clearing hidden by ancient trees and made my way toward the entrance. The path was cracked and uneven, lined with wild grasses and scattered leaves that crunched under my boots. As I approached the massive, weathered door, I could almost sense the burden of countless untold stories pressing in around me. The door itself was heavy and scarred, its wood swollen with time. With a deep breath, I pushed it open. Immediately, a cool draft greeted me, carrying the faint scent of old incense and damp stone, a smell that seemed to speak of prayers long since forgotten. Inside, the vast nave of the church stretched out in dim gloom. Dust motes floated in the weak beam of my flashlight as I stepped over broken pews and shattered fragments of stained glass, their colors muted by decades of neglect. I began my exploration slowly, mindful of every sound. The building was silent, except for the occasional creak of old wood and the steady drip of water seeping through a leaky roof. It was as if the church was holding its breath, preserving its sorrow for only the bravest to uncover. I wandered through the side chapels and narrow corridors, feeling an ever-deepening sense of being watched, not by something overtly menacing, but by memories and echoes of lost souls. In one small chapel off the main hall, I paused before a modest altar draped in a tattered, once beautiful cloth. The stone at its base was carved with symbols that I couldn't place, their meaning obscured by time. I ran my fingers lightly over the cool surface and recalled the fragmented stories I had overheard. How a secret congregation had once gathered in this very space, praying in voices trembling with hope and desperation. Their legacy, it seemed, was woven into the very fabric of the building. As I continued, I found a narrow passage that led to a room I later learned was once a sacristy. There, the atmosphere was different, an oppressive, almost tangible sadness that pressed in on every side. I set down my audio recorder on an old wooden table, partly as a precaution, and partly because I hoped to capture any unusual sounds that might emerge from the silence. At first, nothing happened. I sat for a long while in that room, listening to the low hum of the building's creaks and the soft, irregular drip of water. And then, like the distant sound of a lullaby carried on a breeze, I began to hear it, a low, almost imperceptible chanting. It wasn't the wind, nor was it any mechanical hum. It was a voice, or rather, a chorus of voices, reciting words that resonated with an ancient sorrow. I rose slowly and followed the sound, which led me deeper into the labyrinthine interior of the church. The chanting grew more distinct as I passed through long corridors lined with peeling plaster and faded murals. I found myself drawn to a small circular chamber off the main hall, one I had never noticed before. The room was modest, a simple space dominated by a weathered wooden pulpit and an aged mirror that fractured the light into ghostly patterns. It was in this chamber that the haunting reached its peak. I positioned my recorder carefully, knowing that every nuance might be significant. Then, in a moment that still sends shivers down my spine, I heard a disembodied voice reciting a prayer in an archaic tongue. The words were solemn and filled with a deep, sorrowful power. It wasn't just chanting. It was a lament, a prayer that seemed to weep for lost souls and shattered dreams. I stood there, transfixed, as the voice weaved a tale of grief and longing. The prayer spoke of promises made in desperation, of a covenant sealed with both hope and despair. It mentioned a past tragedy, a night when the congregation had gathered in faith only to be met with a calamity that shattered their world. There were hints of a dark ritual, of a sacrifice made in the name of salvation, and of a curse that had since haunted the church. I couldn't be sure if the prayer was a recounting of events or a plea for redemption, but its tone was unmistakable. It was a lament, echoing the agony of those who had suffered. I remember the exact moment when the voice reached its crescendo. The air in the chamber seemed to grow colder, and my heart pounded as if trying to match the rhythm of that ancient sorrow. Every word resonated with the weight of centuries, each syllable a testament to the despair of a once devout congregation. For several minutes, I listened in silence, allowing the sound to sink into my very soul. The disembodied voice recited what felt like the final prayer of a dying faith, a prayer that, despite its beauty, carried an inescapable chill. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the voice faded into silence. For a long while afterward, the chamber was filled only with the echo of that final, lingering note, and the soft drip of water from the shattered ceiling. I fumbled with my recorder, playing back the captured audio. It was all there. The unmistakable, ghostly recitation of a centuries-old prayer that no one alive had spoken in recent memory. I left the circular chamber with the recorder still running, my mind awash with questions. As I wandered back through the hushed corridors of the church, I began to notice more details that added layers to the mystery. I discovered an old, leather-bound diary tucked behind a rusted side door in a small vestry. Its pages, yellowed with age, chronicled the tragic tale of a priest whose faith was shattered on that very night the prayer was first uttered. In hurried, trembling script, he described how the congregation had been struck by a calamity, a fire that had broken out during a midnight service, claiming the lives of many and leaving the survivors forever marked by guilt and loss. The diary told of desperate attempts to invoke a higher power through forbidden rites, of black candle rituals performed in secret, and of a lingering curse that had settled over the church like a shroud. It wasn't written in a style that could be found in any history book. It was raw, personal, and full of a sorrow so deep it seemed almost supernatural. There were references to symbolic carvings hidden in the church's architecture, to stained glass windows that depicted more than sacred scenes, a visual record of a darkness that no one dared speak of openly. One entry in particular stood out to me. It described a night when the church had been filled with a cold, unnatural darkness, when the very walls seemed to whisper in voices not entirely human. The priest had written about a final moment of clarity, a time when he believed that the church's lament was not just a memory, but a living entity, bound by grief and a curse that defied explanation. The entry ended abruptly with a warning. Beware the silence that follows the last note, for in it, the past reaches out to claim the future. With the diary in hand and the recording etched in my memory, I felt a profound connection to that long-lost tragedy. I couldn't help but wonder if the church had chosen me to bear witness to its sorrowful legacy, or if I had simply been in the right place at the right time to catch a glimpse of a secret that was never meant to be uncovered. In the hours that followed, I sat alone in the church's main hall, listening to the silence and the soft creaks of the old building. I replayed the prayer on my recorder, each playback stirring up emotions that were almost overwhelming. The experience was not something I could explain away as mere hallucination or the trick of aging acoustics. It was real, an echo of a deep, unhealed wound from the past. When I finally left the church that night, I did so with a heavy heart and a mind buzzing with unanswered questions. The building receded into the darkness as I walked back along the overgrown path, its presence lingering in my thoughts long after I had driven away. I never spoke of the exact details to anyone. I kept the diary and the recording as private testaments to a night that defies simple explanation. There is no official record of a church by that name on any map, no archived news of the disaster it bore witness to, only the whispered memories of those who knew, and the undeniable evidence captured in that one unforgettable night. Story number 2, The Shadow in the Window. I've lived in this old house for years, long enough to become familiar with every creak of the floorboards and every whisper of the wind that slips through the gaps in the windows. Even so, I never imagined that a shadow would come to haunt not just the corners of my room, but the very fabric of my nights. It all began on a stormy evening, when the skies darkened with heavy clouds and rain began to fall in a relentless, steady rhythm. I had been sitting alone in the living room, the soft patter of the rain against the window pane lulling me into a state of half-wakefulness. Then I heard it. A rumor, really, from neighbors I'd occasionally exchanged nods with on quiet afternoons. They'd whispered about a shadowy figure that sometimes appeared in the windows of houses along our street when storms rolled in. At first, I dismissed it as local superstition, a story grown out of too many rainy nights and too much imagination. But soon, inexplicable movements began to catch my eye. It started subtly, just a fleeting reflection when I glanced toward the window. I'd see something dark, a shape that flitted past in the periphery of my vision, gone before I could focus on it. At times, I even caught what I could only describe as a ghost-like presence, lingering for a mere moment in the glass, as though someone were watching from outside. The more I tried to ignore it, the more insistent the presence became, like a soft knock at the back of my mind. One night, as the storm raged louder than ever, I sat huddled on my couch, staring out at the swirling rain. I distinctly saw that shadow, tall, shifting, and more defined than ever before, move slowly across the window. It was as if the figure was drawn by the reflections of lightning, its contours momentarily illuminated by each flash. I felt a chill that wasn't entirely due to the cold wind seeping through the cracked window frame. Something was wrong, and I knew I had to act. At first, I thought of ignoring it. Perhaps it was nothing more than an overactive mind fueled by isolation and the eerie ambiance of stormy nights. But then, driven by desperation and a growing sense of dread, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I'd read somewhere about rituals intended to dispel unwanted spirits. With a mixture of skepticism and hope, I gathered a few items: a small candle, some incense, and a few pages from an old book of local lore that I'd stumbled upon in the attic. I set them up in the living room, arranging them on the coffee table in a makeshift circle. as if to create a barrier against the encroaching darkness. I began the ritual with quiet words, uttering invocations I barely remembered from the faded pages of that old book. The rain outside intensified, as if echoing my rising anxiety, and for a moment I felt a spark of hope. However, as soon as I finished the incantations, something unexpected happened. The shadow that had haunted my window earlier did not dissipate. It seemed to grow bolder. Instead of retreating, it pressed against the glass as though emboldened by my attempts to banish it. The flickering reflections of lightning danced around it, and I could see it shifting in forms that were both mesmerizing and terrifying. It was as if my ritual had stirred something within the darkness. I could hear a low, almost imperceptible whisper, not from outside the window, but from within the room itself. I sat frozen, heart pounding, as the presence of that spectral figure became almost tangible, an oppressive force that seemed to seep through the very walls of my home. I realized then that my attempt to dispel it had backfired, making it all the more persistent and dangerous. The following days were filled with anxiety and sleepless nights. Every time the weather turned gloomy, I would catch glimpses of that shifting shadow in the window. Its presence began to affect my daily life, my concentration at work, my conversations with neighbors, even my own sense of self. I tried to reason with myself, insisting that it was just a trick of the light, a manifestation of my own fears. Yet deep down, I knew that something truly paranormal was at play. Desperate for answers and relief, I reached out to someone I'd heard about through whispered recommendations, a man known in these parts as a spiritual guide, someone who had been called upon by others facing inexplicable phenomena. He was an elderly fellow, a quiet, gentle soul with a presence that seemed to command respect and calm in equal measure. I didn't know his name. No one in our small community used it publicly, but his reputation for helping troubled spirits was enough to give me a glimmer of hope. I arranged to meet him at my home on another stormy evening. That night, the rain fell in a steady cadence as if on cue, and the window once again framed that elusive, shifting shadow. The old man arrived quietly, dressed in simple, dark clothing that blended with the night. His eyes held a depth that suggested he had seen many things beyond the realm of ordinary understanding. Without a word, he observed the room, his gaze lingering on the window where the shadow loomed. After a few moments of silence, he spoke softly, his voice carrying a soothing, measured tone. "Sometimes," he said, "the darkness we see is not meant to be banished by force, but understood. Tell me, what have you seen?" I recounted everything. The rumors from neighbors, the fleeting reflections, the long nights filled with a ghostly presence, and the failed ritual that seemed only to make the shadow stronger. The old man listened intently, nodding as if each word confirmed what he already knew. When I finished, he closed his eyes briefly, and then spoke of a different approach. "We must not fight the darkness with our own fear," he explained. "Instead, we must reach out with compassion and humility, acknowledging that what you see is a remnant of pain, a spirit trapped between worlds. Let us try one more time, together, but with a method that honors the past rather than denies it." He instructed me to clear a space in the room and to gather some simple items: a clean cloth, a bowl of water, and a single white candle. As we prepared, he explained that our goal was to offer a symbolic gesture of release, to help the troubled spirit find peace, rather than drive it away through force. I felt a tentative hope rekindling as I followed his quiet, deliberate guidance. Under his steady hand, we lit the candle and placed the bowl of water on a small table near the window. He spoke softly, reciting words that seemed both ancient and comforting. His voice blended with the natural chorus of rain and wind, creating an atmosphere that was not hostile, but deeply respectful. Slowly he gestured towards the window, inviting the shadow to come forth. "Let us welcome what has been burdened by sorrow," he intoned. "May this light and water cleanse the pain that binds you." For a long, silent moment, nothing happened. Until, almost imperceptibly, the shape in the window began to change. The dark figure, which had once pressed against the glass with aggressive persistence, now seemed to waver and recede, as though it were listening. I could see its edges soften, the once menacing outline blurring into something more akin to a human silhouette, overwhelmed by grief. The old man continued his gentle recitation, his words weaving through the room like a soft balm over old wounds. Gradually, as the candle's flame flickered in the breeze of the open window, the presence of the shadow diminished. It no longer loomed threateningly, but instead seemed to withdraw, as if finally understanding that it wasn't alone in its suffering. After what felt like an eternity, the figure vanished entirely, leaving only the sound of rain and the lingering warmth of the candlelight as proof of its existence. I sat there, overwhelmed by relief and wonder. The oppressive feeling that had weighed on me for so long was finally lifting, replaced by a quiet sense of closure. The old man smiled gently, as if acknowledging the significance of the moment. "Sometimes," he said softly, "we must learn that confronting our darkness requires not defiance, but empathy. The spirit you saw was not a force of evil, but one of sorrow, a shadow cast by a past that needs healing." In the days that followed, the nights grew less burdensome. I found that the memory of that relentless shadow in the window slowly faded, replaced by a newfound understanding of the mysteries that sometimes visit us in the dark. I continued to honor the old man's words in my daily life, treating the unknown not with fear, but with the quiet resolve to find compassion even in the inexplicable. Story number 3. The Last Train Ride. I've always been a night commuter, used to the steady hum of the train and the rhythmic clatter of wheels on worn tracks. But there's one ride I can never forget, an experience that defies explanation and has slowly woven itself into the fabric of local legend. It was a night much like any other, with a relentless downpour turning the city into a blurred, waterlogged mirror. I boarded a late-night train, my thoughts occupied with the routine grind of work and the solitude that comes with traveling alone. The platform was nearly deserted, and the rain soaked everything in an eerie, constant rhythm that made time feel both endless and disjointed. As I found a seat near the window, I couldn't help but notice that the usual murmur of fellow passengers was tinged with something odd, a whisper of unease that I couldn't quite place. Around me, a few faces were half hidden by the shadows cast by flickering overhead lights, and in the reflective glass, I saw brief, inexplicable movements. I tried to brush it off as the play of rain on glass, but something in the atmosphere suggested otherwise. The train lurched forward with a creak and a groan, and the world outside blurred into streaks of rain and neon reflections. I remember the way the cold, damp air seeped through the window's condensation, mingling with the faint scent of metal and old upholstery. Every so often I would catch a glimpse of an unusual figure, a shadow or a pale face, for just a split second before it vanished into the murk of the stormy night. As the ride continued, the quiet murmurs of my fellow passengers grew into hushed conversations. I couldn't make out every word, but there were references to times gone by and stories that shouldn't be forgotten, as if some of us were sharing memories from another era. One elderly man, his eyes reflecting a mixture of sorrow and resignation, muttered something about a lost soul riding these rails. His words were barely audible over the drumming rain and the constant clatter of the tracks, yet they sent a chill down my spine. The journey felt strangely elongated, as if each station passed was another step into an unknown realm where time itself had lost meaning. I found myself gazing out the window, mesmerized by the dark landscape streaked with lightning flashes, the raindrops racing each other along the glass. I began to wonder if the storm was more than just a weather phenomenon that night. It felt like a curtain, separating the familiar from something altogether different. Then came the moment that altered everything. Halfway through the ride, as the train wound its way through a particularly desolate stretch of track, a figure appeared in the aisle. I first noticed it as a faint shape at the far end. A person standing still, almost blending with the shadows. At first, I assumed it was just another passenger, albeit one who looked unusually quiet and out of place. But as the train continued, I realized that this figure wasn't moving like the others. No one else seemed to acknowledge its presence. I even glanced at my seatmates, but their eyes remained fixed on their own thoughts or the passing scenery, as if the figure were invisible to them. I leaned over to a young woman sitting beside me and asked in a hushed tone if she had seen that person. She shook her head, her face pale, and murmured, "I only saw him for a moment, like a ghost in the corner." That was all the confirmation I needed. My heart pounded as I watched the figure. Dressed in a long, dark coat, its face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat that cast deep shadows, and yet there was something almost human about its stillness. The figure didn't interact with anyone or make any move to hide. It simply stood there, as if waiting for something. With each jolt of the train, the figure seemed to flicker, appearing a little clearer in one moment, then dissolving back into the darkness the next. As the train rolled on, the atmosphere grew heavier. The steady sound of rain against the windows became a constant companion, each drop punctuating the silence with an almost mournful rhythm. Passengers exchanged wary glances now, and whispered snippets of conversation hinted at long-forgotten stories of spectral sightings on similar rides. I began to recall local rumors, vague and elusive, about a mysterious presence that had haunted the late-night trains for years, a presence said to be linked to a tragedy that no one had ever confirmed. When we finally reached a bend in the tracks that plunged us into a tunnel, the darkness inside was absolute, and for a brief moment, the sound of the train seemed to slow. It was then that I felt it, a cold, inexplicable presence right beside me. I turned slowly, half expecting to see the shadowy figure standing so close that I could feel its chill. Instead, I saw nothing. Just the empty, oppressive darkness. But I could feel it, a heaviness that wasn't there before, as if the very air around me had thickened with a palpable sense of sorrow and longing. The tension reached its peak when, just as the train emerged from the tunnel and the lights flickered back to life, the inexplicable passenger moved. In that split second, I caught a clear glimpse, a ghost-like face, eyes hollow yet filled with an unspoken story of loss, staring directly at me from across the compartment. It wasn't a look of malice, rather, it was a silent plea, a desperate communication from another time. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure melted away into the crowd of normal commuters, leaving no trace behind except the lingering chill in my spine. For the rest of the journey, the train ride felt altered, as if that encounter had shifted the very fabric of reality. The remaining passengers seemed to carry their own secret burdens, their conversations now laced with an air of haunted remembrance. I spent the rest of the trip in a quiet, anxious introspection, replaying every moment in my mind, questioning what I had witnessed. I attempted to rationalize it later. Was it a trick of the light? A collective illusion born of fatigue and the relentless downpour? But the clarity of that ghost-like presence, the way it held my gaze for a fleeting eternity, was something I could not dismiss. I began asking around discreetly, and while many whispered that they had experienced something similar, no one could offer a concrete explanation. Instead, the tale evolved into a modern urban legend, passed from one wary commuter to the next, each version differing in details but united by the shared feeling of an inexplicable encounter on a stormy night. At first, driven by a mix of fear and determination, I attempted my own method to rid myself of that unsettling memory. I tried a few rituals, quiet invocations, and simple prayers meant to cleanse the spirit of lingering dread. But nothing seemed to work. In fact, with each attempt, the presence only appeared to intensify, as if it were feeding on my anxiety. My sleep was disturbed by recurring visions of that spectral figure, and I found myself constantly glancing at the window whenever the train slowed. Desperate for resolution, I sought help from an old spiritual advisor, a man reputed in our small circle for his wisdom and quiet strength. I won't mention his name. He is known only by those who have felt the weight of such inexplicable encounters. With his guidance, I learned that sometimes the energies that haunt us are not meant to be fought head-on, but rather understood and gently released. He taught me that the shadow I saw might be a remnant of a soul trapped between times, a sorrowful echo of past tragedy, calling out for acknowledgement rather than vengeance. Story number 4. The Cryptic Letters. I've always been a practical person, a realist who trusted only what I could see and touch. That was until a series of inexplicable letters found their way into my life one autumn evening. I still remember the day as clearly as if it were yesterday, though I cannot pinpoint an exact date. The weather was overcast and cool, the kind of day that made the world seem subdued and reflective. I was wandering the back streets of our town, not with any particular destination in mind, but simply looking to escape the endless routine of daily life. It was then, almost by accident, that I discovered an old, abandoned storefront tucked away behind a row of shuttered businesses. The building itself was unremarkable, a relic of another time, its windows long since clouded over with dust and neglect, its door slightly ajar, as if inviting a stray soul inside. I felt an inexplicable pull, as if the place itself were calling out a secret that only I could hear. Stepping cautiously over cracked pavement, I pushed the door open and was greeted by a silence so deep it seemed to hum. Inside, the store was a chaotic mix of forgotten objects, broken shelves, discarded signs, and scattered remnants of what might once have been merchandise. It was a small space, its walls covered with faded posters and handwritten notes that had deteriorated with time. Amidst the debris on an old wooden counter, I noticed a stack of letters bound together with fraying twine. Their paper was yellowed and brittle, the ink faded yet still legible in parts. I gathered them carefully, feeling as if I were cradling fragile fragments of a lost past. Something told me these letters were not ordinary. They carried the weight of untold stories. I took them home, not sure whether to be excited or unsettled by my find. That evening, as dusk turned into night and the quiet settled over my modest apartment, I sat down at my desk with the letters spread out before me. I lit a small lamp that cast a soft glow over the pages and began reading. Each letter was addressed to someone, though the recipients' names were never fully revealed, and they chronicled the voice of an unknown correspondent. The language was fragmented and at times cryptic, filled with rushed sentences, scribbled corrections, and desperate pleas. There were references to an unsolved crime that had occurred decades ago, described in a way that hinted at deep personal loss and betrayal. One letter, in particular, caught my attention. It began with a hurried greeting that quickly dissolved into a detailed account of a night marred by tragedy. The writer mentioned a final hour that was witnessed by a select few, an event shrouded in secrecy and local gossip. The narrative was incomplete. Key details were either erased or left deliberately ambiguous. I spent hours poring over every word, trying to reconstruct the sequence of events. It mentioned a robbery gone wrong, the mysterious disappearance of a person whose name was only half written, and an object of great importance. A locket, perhaps, or a ring. The descriptions were vague, yet there was an undeniable sense of urgency, as if the writer feared that time was running out to reveal the truth. Over the following days, I read and reread each letter, gradually piecing together a narrative from the disjointed fragments. I began to notice recurring symbols, a brief reference to a clock stopped at midnight, the mention of a particular street that no one in our town seemed willing to discuss, and the use of a peculiar phrase that hinted at a secret society or hidden feud. Every detail, though incomplete, seemed designed to create a puzzle that was both intriguing and deeply unsettling. As I delved deeper into the letters, I started noticing subtle echoes of their contents in my own life. One afternoon, while waiting for an errand to conclude at a local cafe, I overheard a conversation between two patrons discussing an incident that had occurred in the neighborhood many years ago. Their voices were hushed, and they spoke of a crime that had left a permanent scar on the community. A crime that bore an eerie resemblance to the fragmented account in the letters. I couldn't help but wonder if the letters were somehow connected to that long-forgotten tragedy. I began to discreetly ask a few older residents about the incident mentioned in the letters. In each conversation, I received the same cautious response, a mixture of denial and whispered acknowledgement, as if the truth was something everyone knew, but no one dared to discuss openly. The more I pressed, the more the topic was met with vague recollections and a collective reluctance to name names or dates. It became apparent that whatever had happened was a subject of both fear and sorrow, something that the community preferred to keep buried in the past. Then came a breakthrough that sent a chill down my spine. One quiet evening, as I sat in my study reviewing the letters once more, I noticed an anomaly in one of the pages, a detail that I remembered all too well from a recent event. It was a description of a peculiar mark found on an old door, a phrase that spoke of a specific time in a manner that mirrored an incident I had witnessed just a week before. I immediately compared the handwriting in that letter with the memory of what I had seen on that fateful day, and the resemblance was uncanny. It was as though the past and present had momentarily converged, linking a decades-old mystery with current events in a way that defied explanation. I felt both exhilarated and unnerved. The letters, once a mere collection of disjointed thoughts, now hinted at an ongoing connection, a living thread that tied an old unsolved crime to something unfolding in the present. I began to document every detail in a small journal, writing down my observations, the whispered conversations I had overheard, and even the subtle changes in my own emotions as I tried to understand the deeper meaning behind the cryptic messages. In the weeks that followed, my nights became filled with restless contemplation. I would lie awake in the quiet hours, the soft hum of a distant city life outside my window, serving as a reminder that I was not alone in this world of secrets. I started rereading the letters under the dim light of my bedside lamp, letting each fragment sink in slowly. The words seemed to speak of loss and regret, of opportunities missed and lives forever altered. There was a recurring lament in them, a sense of desperate hope for redemption that was never fully realized. One particularly quiet night, when the world outside was hushed and my mind was teeming with unanswered questions, I decided to retrace my steps back to the abandoned store. I needed to know if there was anything more to be found, some final piece of the puzzle that I had missed on that first visit. With a mix of apprehension and determination, I made my way through the familiar back alleys, the letters safely tucked away in my bag. The building looked even more forlorn in the muted light of the evening, its details blurred by time. I wandered slowly through its dusty corridors, checking every nook and cranny, hoping to find additional clues. There, behind a fallen shelf, I discovered a small, hidden compartment. Inside lay a bundle of documents, far more disorganized and chaotic than the neat stack of letters I'd found earlier. Among them were what appeared to be old photographs, black and white images of people whose faces were blurred by the passage of time, and a few newspaper clippings with headlines that I could barely decipher. One clipping mentioned a tragedy in the night, without offering any further details, and another hinted at a missing person whose case was never officially closed. I gathered these remnants carefully, aware that they might hold the key to understanding the full scope of the mystery. Returning home with my new findings, I spent long hours cross-referencing the details from the letters, the photographs, and the clippings. I created a timeline in my journal, trying to link the scattered events together into a coherent narrative. But even as I connected the dots, there were glaring gaps, moments where the story seemed to fade into nothingness, leaving me with a lingering sense of incompleteness. It was as if someone had deliberately left parts of the puzzle unsolvable, ensuring that the full truth remained forever hidden. Story number 5. The Mysterious House. When I first moved to this quiet town, I was excited to start afresh in a charming old house. But I soon discovered that every old building holds its own secrets, and mine was no exception. Almost immediately after settling in, I began to hear whispers, quiet murmurs from neighbors about strange happenings. They spoke of flickering lights in windows long after dusk, distant cries that chilled the soul in the dead of night, and unexplained knocks on doors when no one should be there. One elderly neighbor, Mrs. Raymond, recalled how the air would suddenly turn icy, and shadows would dance on the walls as if something unseen was passing by. I experienced my first unnerving moment on a rainy afternoon, though the rain was nothing more than nature's background music to what was unfolding inside my home. While exploring the attic for a quiet corner to read, I discovered a concealed compartment behind a stack of old boxes. There, wrapped in a faded cloth, lay a battered leather journal that smelled faintly of old paper and sorrow. As I slowly turned the brittle pages, I was drawn into a narrative that was as horrifying as it was real. The journal belonged to a former resident, a woman named Eliza, whose life had been tragically cut short. According to the entries, Eliza had once been a hopeful soul who moved into the house much like I had, unaware of its dark past. She became entangled in a series of terrifying events involving black magic. Eliza wrote of a secret cult that met in the dead of night in the hidden basement of the house. Their rituals, performed in whispered chants and under the light of a full moon, were designed to summon a force they believed would grant them eternal life and power. But the price was steep. A sacrifice had to be made. Eliza's final entries described how she was drawn into their circle, initially lured by promises of healing old wounds and escaping past regrets. One night, under the glow of a blood-red moon, they performed a ritual that went horribly wrong. In a frenzy of chanting and dark incantations, she was offered as a sacrifice. Her blood, they believed, was meant to seal the pact with an otherworldly force. I felt a cold shiver as I read her final desperate words. "My soul is bound, and this house will forever bear the weight of our sins. If you hear these words, know that we never truly left." The ink had faded, but the pain was still raw, as if Eliza had written the words just moments before her untimely end. After closing the journal, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive with her lingering presence. Over the following nights, strange phenomena began to manifest. I'd hear a soft tapping that wasn't the wind, see a fleeting glimpse of a shadow in the mirror, and feel a chill as if someone, Eliza perhaps, was standing right beside me. On one particularly still night, while I sat in the living room, I distinctly heard a distant cry that seemed to echo Eliza's anguish. It was a sound that could only be described as both a lament and a warning. I started speaking with more neighbors, and their accounts only deepened the mystery. Several recalled incidents where guests had vanished without a trace, or where inexplicable symbols were found etched in hidden corners of the house. One story told of a guest who awoke to find a series of cryptic messages written in red on the walls, a stark reminder of the night Eliza was sacrificed. The more I uncovered, the more the past and present began to blur. I began to notice that on certain nights, when the moon was high, the house seemed to resonate with a deep, mournful energy. I would sit in silence, listening to the soft creaks of the old floorboards and the faint whispers that drifted through the hallways. In those moments, I felt an overwhelming presence, a mix of sorrow, anger, and a yearning to be remembered. It was as if the house itself was trying to confess the sins of its past. One evening, driven by both dread and determination, I revisited the journal and retraced Eliza's tragic story. I spent hours piecing together every detail, every hint of black magic and cursed ritual, trying to understand how such darkness had taken root here. The final page left me with more questions than answers. Was the ritual the work of deluded desperation? Or had these dark forces been at play long before Eliza's time? Was her spirit now bound to the house, forever a part of its haunting legacy? Even now, I remain unsettled by the mysteries of that house. The house stands as a silent testament to a tragedy that defies easy explanation, a relic of black magic, sacrifice, and enduring sorrow. Story number 6. The Midnight Broadcast. I still remember the nights when I used to host my late-night radio show. There's something about the darkness and the low hum of the equipment that makes the world seem both alive and strangely haunted. I'd been broadcasting for years, but one night changed everything. It began as a typical storm. The wind was howling outside the studio, and every now and then, a flash of lightning illuminated the worn-out panels on the wall. I was alone in the control room. I had just settled into my broadcast routine when an unexpected sound broke through the static. A faint, ghostly transmission that didn't belong to any scheduled segment. At first, I thought it was just interference. I adjusted the dials, trying to clear the signal, but the sound persisted. It was a series of muffled voices, overlapping with soft, eerie music, almost as if someone was trying to tell me something. I leaned closer to the microphone, my heart pounding in sync with the storm outside. "Hello?" I ventured, my voice shaky yet curious. There was no immediate response, only the sound of rain and the whisper of static. I decided to record the transmission, thinking it might be a prank or a technical glitch. But as the minutes passed, the messages grew clearer. In between the crackles, I began to catch snippets of conversation. Phrases that mentioned unsolved tragedies, names that sent a shiver down my spine, and references to events from a long-forgotten era. It wasn't random static anymore. It was a broadcast from the past, laden with sorrow and mystery. I remember distinctly one particular phrase that stopped me cold. The night of the shattered glass and silent screams. That sentence, delivered in a voice that trembled with both urgency and regret, hinted at a local disaster I'd only heard whispers about as a child. I recalled murmurs in the town about a catastrophic event, one that had been buried beneath layers of time and official silence. Determined to learn more, I began to piece together the fragmented transmissions. As I listened, the studio's atmosphere shifted. The familiar hum of my equipment seemed to fade into the background as I became absorbed by the unfolding narrative. The voices were not hostile, but they carried a weight of grief and an unfulfilled need to be remembered. In the static, I could discern details of a tragic night, a fatal accident, cries that echoed in an empty hall, and a promise that the truth would one day be uncovered. Every so often, I would hear what sounded like a name, faded, barely audible, as if spoken through decades of loss. One of those names, Evelyn, kept coming up, intertwined with phrases about an explosion and a building that once teemed with life. I began to feel an unsettling connection. My mind raced with questions. Had these voices been trapped in time, waiting for someone to listen? I recalled a personal experience from my early days as a host. I'd once covered a story about a fire that had taken a beloved local theater decades ago, and the details had always haunted me. But this was different. This was a message meant for me, reaching out through the static of a stormy night. In that moment, I decided to record every word, every nuance of the ghostly broadcast. I even improvised questions into the air, hoping for a response that would clarify the mystery. At times, the transmission would pause, as if gathering its strength, only to resume with a murmur that felt almost conversational. Remember us. We still wait. The truth lies within the ashes. The more I listened, the more I began to piece together a timeline in my head. The unsolved tragedies mentioned in the broadcast painted a picture of a local disaster, a calamity that had been swiftly covered up, its victims erased from public memory. I combed through my own archives, comparing the voices' words with old clippings and faded newspaper reports. There was a match, albeit incomplete. A disaster involving a building collapse on a rainy night. A fire that consumed not just structures but lives and hopes. It was as if the broadcast was not only a lament for the lost, but also an urgent call to remember, and perhaps to seek justice. One segment of the transmission stood out sharply, a cryptic message that I struggled to understand at first. The voice mentioned, "When the storm devours the silence, the letter shall reveal the truth." I paused the recording and listened to that phrase on repeat. I wondered if there was a hidden meaning. A letter? Perhaps a clue left behind in old correspondence, or a faded document tucked away in a forgotten file. I recalled a conversation with an elderly local who had once hinted at a secret kept by the town council. Something about an unsent letter that was supposed to explain everything but had mysteriously vanished with time. Determined to follow this thread, I decided to recheck the archives at the local library the next day. But that night, in the solitude of the studio, I took a risk. I slowly rewound the recording and listened carefully, focusing on every detail. The background hum of the machine, the soft clatter of raindrops on the window, and the voice that grew steadily more urgent with each repetition. The cryptic phrase repeated, each time with subtle variations, a whisper of static here, a slight change in tone there. It was as if the message was adapting to my understanding, urging me forward. I vividly recall the chill that ran down my spine as I recognized the faint sound of a heartbeat underneath the static. A heartbeat that didn't match my own, as if echoing from someone long gone. My hands trembled as I adjusted the volume, trying desperately to capture every nuance. I could almost feel the weight of history pressing against me, a tangible force that made the hairs on my arms stand up. The voices were no longer just a distant murmur. They were becoming personal, as if I was being drawn into their unresolved sorrow. Minutes turned into what felt like hours. I jotted down notes, piecing together the scattered clues, references to a specific date, a location, and even a weather pattern remarkably similar to tonight's storm. I started to realize that this was more than a random glitch. It was a deliberate broadcast, a final attempt by the departed to tell their story. I knew I was treading on dangerous ground. Some things, once uncovered, might change the way you see your past forever. Then came the moment of climax. As the storm outside reached its peak, with thunder rolling like distant drums, the voice grew almost frantic. "Find the letter. It is the key," it cried, before a long, agonizing pause. In that silence, I could almost hear the sound of a heart breaking. Then, in a final, desperate burst, the transmission declared, "Evelyn, your voice, our memory, never let us be forgotten." And as if that were all it had to say, the message dissolved into a low, droning static that filled the room. For a long, agonizing minute, nothing came but the relentless sound of the storm and the soft hiss of the static. I sat there, frozen, trying to absorb every word. The final message had vanished into the white noise of the night, leaving behind more questions than answers. Had it been a real message from the past? Or was it simply the product of an overactive mind caught in the grip of a powerful storm? I couldn't be sure. In the quiet that followed, I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly. The chill of the night seemed to seep into my bones, and every creak of the building reminded me that I was alone with these echoes from another time. I knew that by the time the storm subsided, I would have to face the next day with the weight of this mystery pressing on my mind. The unsolved tragedy, the long-forgotten disaster that the transmission alluded to, would not let me rest. There was a story here, hidden in the ruins of memory and the static of a stormy broadcast, and I felt compelled to follow it through no matter where it might lead. Even now, on quieter nights when the rain taps softly against my window, I think back to that fateful broadcast. I still wonder about Evelyn and the missing letter, the cryptic words that seemed to carry the voices of those who lost everything. The final static left a lingering question in my mind. Was it really over? Or was this just the beginning of a mystery that would forever haunt the midnight airwaves? I eventually decided to share my experience on air the following week. Not as a definitive answer, but as an invitation for others to remember. I recounted every detail: the storm, the uncanny voice, and the desperate plea hidden within the static. I left the broadcast open-ended, allowing the mystery to live on in the hearts and minds of the listeners. That night, as I signed off, I couldn't help but feel that somewhere out there, in another storm, another lonely radio station, someone else was hearing the same call, a call that echoed through the darkness, desperate to be acknowledged. Until then, the mystery of that midnight broadcast remains etched into my memory. Story number 7. The Haunted Motel at the Edge of Town. I still remember the day I pulled into that desolate stretch of highway on a night that felt heavy with secrets. I was a weary traveler, looking for a brief refuge from a long, relentless journey. The sign for the motel was barely lit, its faded letters swaying gently as if to warn me away. But exhausted and with no better option, I decided to check in. The motel itself was a relic from another era. The building had seen better days. Its peeling paint and rusted fixtures told a story of neglect and forgotten memories. I walked up the narrow path, my footsteps echoing in the quiet of the night. Even though the sky was overcast and a soft drizzle had begun, it wasn't as if the rain was the centerpiece of the evening. It was just part of the background, as natural as the creak of old floorboards. At the front desk, the clerk gave me a tired smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He handed me an old-fashioned key, its metal cool against my hand, and offered a few murmured warnings about the motel's past. "You might hear things at night," he said in a low, almost conspiratorial tone. "Things that don't quite add up." I nodded, half dismissing his words as the ramblings of someone who'd seen too much over the years. My room was at the end of a narrow, dimly lit corridor. The door was heavy and creaked open to reveal a space that still held a faint scent of stale cigarette smoke, and something unidentifiably old, like dust mixed with memories. The bed was covered with a threadbare quilt, and an ancient clock on the wall ticked steadily, its sound oddly comforting in the silence. That night, as I settled in and tried to unwind from the road, I couldn't help but recall the local legends I'd heard on my way here. Past guests had whispered of strange disappearances, of nights when the motel seemed to breathe with an unseen life. I'd laughed them off at the time, chalking it up to ghost stories meant to spook travelers. But as the hours crept by, a feeling of unease began to take root. I was lying in bed when I first noticed it, a soft, almost imperceptible murmur that seemed to come from the walls. It wasn't loud enough to be a clear voice, but it was rhythmic, persistent. At first I assumed it was just the building settling or the hum of the old wiring. Yet, there was something more, a subtle urgency behind those murmurs, as if they were trying to say something. Unable to sleep, I got up and wandered out into the hallway. The corridor was nearly empty, lit by a single, flickering overhead light that cast long, wavering shadows on the faded wallpaper. I paused at the end of the hall, where a narrow door, slightly ajar, caught my attention. It was marked vacant in chipped letters, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I felt drawn to it. The room beyond was smaller than my own, with an atmosphere that felt heavier, as if it were steeped in a past too painful to forget. I stepped inside and was immediately struck by the texture of the space. The air felt damp and cool, carrying the faint odor of old fabric and something metallic. On a dusty desk, I found a stack of yellowed newspapers and a small, leather-bound notebook. The headlines spoke of unsolved tragedies and mysterious disappearances that dated back decades. Stories that echoed the whispered legends I'd heard earlier that evening. I sat down at the desk, my fingers trembling slightly as I turned the pages. One article, in particular, detailed the mysterious vanishing of a local family from this very motel. The article was incomplete, with several paragraphs missing as if they'd been deliberately excised. My heart raced as I thought about the implications. Had these stories been more than just rumors? Could the motel itself have been the silent witness to unspeakable events? As I sifted through the articles, a chill ran down my spine. The room was silent except for the slow tick of the clock and the gentle, irregular sound of the distant rain against the window. But then I heard it. A soft, unmistakable murmur, this time coming from the far corner of the room. I turned slowly and saw something that made me question everything I believed about that night. There, on a small table tucked behind a stack of old suitcases, lay an object I hadn't noticed before. A small, ornate music box. It was delicately carved, with intricate patterns that hinted at craftsmanship from another time. Without knowing why, I reached out and opened it. A haunting melody began to play, a tune that seemed at once familiar and heartbreakingly sad. The music filled the quiet room, and for a moment I felt as though I was not alone. The melody brought back a flood of memories from my childhood. The sound of my grandmother's lullabies, the way she'd hum softly during long, dreary nights. But now, that same melody carried a different weight, a layer of sorrow that seemed to seep from the very core of the object. I couldn't shake the feeling that this music box was a remnant of a past tragedy, a tangible echo of someone's lost hope. After a few minutes, the music box wound down, and silence returned. I was left with a profound sense of dread mingled with a desperate curiosity. My mind raced with questions. Who did this belong to? Why was it here, hidden in a room that was marked as vacant? And what did it have to do with the disappearances and eerie testimonies of past guests? I spent the next hour in that room, piecing together fragments of clues. I read through the notebook, which contained handwritten notes in a shaky script. The entries mentioned strange occurrences, a guest seeing a shadowy figure in the hallway, another hearing a whisper in a language they couldn't understand, and yet another describing the eerie feeling of being watched. The notebook ended abruptly, with a final line scrawled in red ink. "They will never let us leave." The significance of those words wasn't lost on me. It felt as though the previous occupant had been desperate to communicate something, an urgent plea, or a warning that had been silenced too soon. I left the room with more questions than answers, but the encounter had left an indelible mark on me. There was something about that vacant room that hinted at unspeakable events, a dark history that the motel seemed determined to keep hidden. Returning to my own room, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed by an unseen presence. Every creak of the floor, every rustle of the wind outside, now carried an undercurrent of menace. I lay in bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was the next to become part of the motel's mysterious lore. When morning finally came, the sky was overcast, and the drizzle had given way to a light, steady rain. I packed my things in silence, each movement heavy with the weight of unresolved questions. As I drove away from the motel, a lingering sense of dread clung to me, a reminder that some mysteries refuse to be neatly wrapped up or forgotten. Even now, I think back on that night with a mix of sorrow and unease. The motel at the edge of town remains a puzzle, a place where the past seeps into the present in subtle, haunting ways. I never found out exactly what happened there, and perhaps that's how it should remain. Some secrets, I believe, are meant to linger in the shadows, quietly urging us to remember that not all that is lost can be found again. Story number 8. The Forgotten Cemetery Angel. I've spent more years tending to this old cemetery than I care to remember. A patch of forgotten earth where memories and mysteries intertwine under the ever-changing sky. I'm not one to boast about strange occurrences, but there's one event in particular that has never left me. It was a night that blurred the line between grief and the inexplicable, a night when even the angels seemed to weep. I usually work through the evenings, ensuring that every headstone is in place and every gate securely latched. On one night, though I never recall the exact date, it feels like it happened in a time that no calendar remembers. I finished my rounds and paused near the old angel statue. This isn't a monument found in guidebooks. It's an unmarked relic standing in a quiet corner of the cemetery, its marble face worn smooth by the passage of time and relentless seasons. That night, I remember walking slowly along the narrow, uneven path, lined with wild overgrowth and ancient trees. As I neared the statue, something in the atmosphere shifted. The air felt unusually heavy, as if laden with unsaid sorrows. The statue itself was something I'd always known as the guardian angel among us caretakers. Its features were indistinct, softened by decades of neglect, yet somehow it carried an ineffable sadness that resonated with anyone who glanced at it. I found a familiar bench beneath a twisted oak and settled in, my eyes fixed on the marble face. I wasn't expecting much, just the usual eerie quiet of a place where the past never truly fades. After a while, as the rain deepened and the night grew colder, I noticed a subtle movement at the edge of my vision. In the murky shadows cast by a lone, flickering lamp, there appeared a dark figure. At first, I dismissed it as a trick of the light or the sway of a branch. But the figure moved with deliberate intent, slowly approaching the statue. I strained to make out any details, a hood perhaps, or just the outline of a person shrouded in darkness. The ambiguity of it all only heightened the mystery. I remember watching, heart thumping, as the figure stopped a few paces from the statue and stood motionless. For what felt like an eternity, we were locked in a silent communion. The guardian of the cemetery and the enigmatic stranger. The rain drummed relentlessly around us, yet in that moment, the world seemed to pause. Then, something utterly unexpected happened. I couldn't tell if it was a trick of the rain or the echo of an ancient sorrow, but the statue began to change before my eyes. At first, there were just tiny glimmers along its face, a shimmer that wasn't simply reflected light. Slowly, as if stirred by a force beyond explanation, delicate droplets started to trace a path down the carved cheek of the angel. They glistened as though they were tears, falling in a measured rhythm that mirrored the steady rainfall. I reached out for my recorder, a habit born of years of witnessing unusual things. But even as I fumbled with its buttons, my eyes remained locked on the weeping statue. The figure nearby did not move. It merely observed, as if sharing in the silent lament of the stone guardian. I couldn't bring myself to speak. All I could do was listen, to the rain, to the soft, almost imperceptible rustle of leaves, and to my own breath mingling with an overwhelming sense of melancholy. There's a story, or rather a rumor, that some say has been passed down quietly among those who know this cemetery. It is said that, long ago, a young soul met an untimely end on these grounds, a tragedy that left a wound in the very fabric of the land. Over time, that sorrow became intertwined with the stone of the angel, turning it into an eternal witness of grief. Whether you believe it or not, that night left me with an undeniable impression that something beyond mere folklore was at work. For a long while after the figure disappeared into the obscurity of the rainy night, I sat there, trying to understand the inexplicable. I replayed every moment in my mind. The way the rain seemed to weep alongside the angel, the silent vigil of the mysterious visitor, and the weight of the atmosphere that made even the whispering wind sound like a lament. I recorded the sounds, though the playback captured only the natural symphony of rainfall and distant rustles, as if the poignant moment itself had dissolved into the night. In the days and weeks that followed, I spoke of that encounter only in hushed tones, with fellow caretakers and a few trusted souls. None of us could point to any official record or documented event that verified what we'd seen. In fact, if you were to search for details, names, dates, locations, there would be nothing concrete to find. It is as if the memory of that night is meant to exist only in the hearts and minds of those who witnessed it, forever untraceable by the prying fingers of time and technology. Story number 9. The Last Train Ride. I've always been a night commuter, used to the steady hum of the train and the rhythmic clatter of wheels on worn tracks. But there's one ride I can never forget, an experience that defies explanation and has slowly woven itself into the fabric of local legend. It was a night much like any other, with a relentless downpour turning the city into a blurred, waterlogged mirror. I boarded a late-night train, my thoughts occupied with the routine grind of work and the solitude that comes with traveling alone. The platform was nearly deserted, and the rain soaked everything in an eerie, constant rhythm that made time feel both endless and disjointed. As I found a seat near the window, I couldn't help but notice that the usual murmur of fellow passengers was tinged with something odd, a whisper of unease that I couldn't quite place. Around me, a few faces were half hidden by the shadows cast by flickering overhead lights, and in the reflective glass, I saw brief, inexplicable movements. I tried to brush it off as the play of rain on glass, but something in the atmosphere suggested otherwise. The train lurched forward with a creak and a groan, and the world outside blurred into streaks of rain and neon reflections. I remember the way the cold, damp air seeped through the window's condensation, mingling with the faint scent of metal and old upholstery. Every so often, I would catch a glimpse of an unusual figure, a shadow or a pale face, for just a split second before it vanished into the murk of the stormy night. As the ride continued, the quiet murmurs of my fellow passengers grew into hushed conversations. I couldn't make out every word, but there were references to times gone by and stories that shouldn't be forgotten, as if some of us were sharing memories from another era. One elderly man, his eyes reflecting a mixture of sorrow and resignation, muttered something about a lost soul riding these rails. His words were barely audible over the drumming rain and the constant clatter of the tracks. Yet they sent a chill down my spine. The journey felt strangely elongated, as if each station passed was another step into an unknown realm where time itself had lost meaning. I found myself gazing out the window, mesmerized by the dark landscape streaked with lightning flashes, the raindrops racing each other along the glass. I began to wonder if the storm was more than just a weather phenomenon that night. It felt like a curtain, separating the familiar from something altogether different. Then came the moment that altered everything. Halfway through the ride, as the train wound its way through a particularly desolate stretch of track, a figure appeared in the aisle. I first noticed it as a faint shape at the far end, a person standing still, almost blending with the shadows. At first, I assumed it was just another passenger, albeit one who looked unusually quiet and out of place. But as the train continued, I realized that this figure wasn't moving like the others. No one else seemed to acknowledge its presence. I even glanced at my seatmates, but their eyes remained fixed on their own thoughts or the passing scenery, as if the figure were invisible to them. I leaned over to a young woman sitting beside me and asked in a hushed tone if she had seen that person. She shook her head, her face pale, and murmured, "I only saw him for a moment, like a ghost in the corner." That was all the confirmation I needed. My heart pounded as I watched the figure. Dressed in a long, dark coat, its face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat that cast deep shadows, and yet there was something almost human about its stillness. The figure didn't interact with anyone or make any move to hide. It simply stood there, as if waiting for something. With each jolt of the train, the figure seemed to flicker, appearing a little clearer in one moment, then dissolving back into the darkness the next. As the train rolled on, the atmosphere grew heavier. The steady sound of rain against the windows became a constant companion, each drop punctuating the silence with an almost mournful rhythm. Passengers exchanged wary glances now, and whispered snippets of conversation hinted at long-forgotten stories of spectral sightings on similar rides. I began to recall local rumors, vague and elusive, about a mysterious presence that had haunted the late-night trains for years, a presence said to be linked to a tragedy that no one had ever confirmed. When we finally reached a bend in the tracks that plunged us into a tunnel, the darkness inside was absolute, and for a brief moment, the sound of the train seemed to slow. It was then that I felt it, a cold, inexplicable presence right beside me. I turned slowly, half expecting to see the shadowy figure standing so close that I could feel its chill. Instead, I saw nothing. Just the empty, oppressive darkness, but I could feel it, a heaviness that wasn't there before, as if the very air around me had thickened with a palpable sense of sorrow and longing. The tension reached its peak when, just as the train emerged from the tunnel and the lights flickered back to life, the inexplicable passenger moved. In that split second, I caught a clear glimpse, a ghost-like face, eyes hollow yet filled with an unspoken story of loss, staring directly at me from across the compartment. It wasn't a look of malice. Rather, it was a silent plea, a desperate communication from another time. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure melted away into the crowd of normal commuters, leaving no trace behind except the lingering chill in my spine. For the rest of the journey, the train ride felt altered, as if that encounter had shifted the very fabric of reality. The remaining passengers seemed to carry their own secret burdens, their conversations now laced with an air of haunted remembrance. I spent the rest of the trip in a quiet, anxious introspection, replaying every moment in my mind, questioning what I had witnessed. I attempted to rationalize it later. Was it a trick of the light, a collective illusion born of fatigue and the relentless downpour? But the clarity of that ghost-like presence, the way it held my gaze for a fleeting eternity, was something I could not dismiss. I began asking around discreetly, and while many whispered that they had experienced something similar, no one could offer a concrete explanation. Instead, the tale evolved into a modern urban legend, passed from one wary commuter to the next, each version differing in details but united by the shared feeling of an inexplicable encounter on a stormy night. At first, driven by a mix of fear and determination, I attempted my own method to rid myself of that unsettling memory. I tried a few rituals, quiet invocations, and simple prayers meant to cleanse the spirit of lingering dread, but nothing seemed to work. In fact, with each attempt, the presence only appeared to intensify, as if it were feeding on my anxiety. My sleep was disturbed by recurring visions of that spectral figure, and I found myself constantly glancing at the window whenever the train slowed. Desperate for resolution, I sought help from an old spiritual advisor, a man reputed in our small circle for his wisdom and quiet strength. I won't mention his name. He is known only by those who have felt the weight of such inexplicable encounters. With his guidance, I learned that sometimes the energies that haunt us are not meant to be fought head-on, but rather understood and gently released. He taught me that the shadow I saw might be a remnant of a soul trapped between times, a sorrowful echo of past tragedy, calling out for acknowledgement rather than vengeance. Under his careful counsel, I began a process of quiet reflection and mindfulness, a series of meditative practices aimed not at banishing the memory, but at reconciling with it. Gradually, the nightly terror diminished, replaced by a sober acceptance of the unknown. I started to see that the ghostly presence on that train wasn't necessarily an evil force, but rather a silent witness to events long past. A reminder that our lives, too, are intertwined with mysteries that defy simple explanation. Story number 10, The Cryptic Letters. I've always been a practical person, a realist who trusted only what I could see and touch. That was until a series of inexplicable letters found their way into my life, one autumn evening. I still remember the day as clearly as if it were yesterday, though I cannot pinpoint an exact date. The weather was overcast and cool, the kind of day that made the world seem subdued and reflective. I was wandering the back streets of our town, not with any particular destination in mind, but simply looking to escape the endless routine of daily life. It was then, almost by accident, that I discovered an old, abandoned storefront tucked away behind a row of shuttered businesses. The building itself was unremarkable, a relic of another time, its windows long since clouded over with dust and neglect, its door slightly ajar, as if inviting a stray soul inside. I felt an inexplicable pull, as if the place itself were calling out a secret that only I could hear. Stepping cautiously over cracked pavement, I pushed the door open and was greeted by a silence so deep it seemed to hum. Inside, the store was a chaotic mix of forgotten objects, broken shelves, discarded signs, and scattered remnants of what might once have been merchandise. It was a small space, its walls covered with faded posters and handwritten notes that had deteriorated with time. Amidst the debris on an old wooden counter, I noticed a stack of letters bound together with fraying twine. Their paper was yellowed and brittle, the ink faded yet still legible in parts. I gathered them carefully, feeling as if I were cradling fragile fragments of a lost past. Something told me these letters were not ordinary. They carried the weight of untold stories. I took them home, not sure whether to be excited or unsettled by my find. That evening, as dusk turned into night and the quiet settled over my modest apartment, I sat down at my desk with the letters spread out before me. I lit a small lamp that cast a soft glow over the pages and began reading. Each letter was addressed to someone, though the recipients' names were never fully revealed, and they chronicled the voice of an unknown correspondent. The language was fragmented and at times cryptic, filled with rushed sentences, scribbled corrections, and desperate pleas. There were references to an unsolved crime that had occurred decades ago, described in a way that hinted at deep personal loss and betrayal. One letter, in particular, caught my attention. It began with a hurried greeting that quickly dissolved into a detailed account of a night marred by tragedy. The writer mentioned a final hour that was witnessed by a select few, an event shrouded in secrecy and local gossip. The narrative was incomplete. Key details were either erased or left deliberately ambiguous. I spent hours poring over every word, trying to reconstruct the sequence of events. It mentioned a robbery gone wrong, the mysterious disappearance of a person whose name was only half written, and an object of great importance. A locket, perhaps, or a ring. The descriptions were vague, yet there was an undeniable sense of urgency, as if the writer feared that time was running out to reveal the truth. Over the following days, I read and reread each letter, gradually piecing together a narrative from the disjointed fragments. I began to notice recurring symbols, a brief reference to a clock stopped at midnight, the mention of a particular street that no one in our town seemed willing to discuss, and the use of a peculiar phrase that hinted at a secret society or hidden feud. Every detail, though incomplete, seemed designed to create a puzzle that was both intriguing and deeply unsettling. As I delved deeper into the letters, I started noticing subtle echoes of their contents in my own life. One afternoon, while waiting for an errand to conclude at a local cafe, I overheard a conversation between two patrons discussing an incident that had occurred in the neighborhood many years ago. Their voices were hushed, and they spoke of a crime that had left a permanent scar on the community, a crime that bore an eerie resemblance to the fragmented account in the letters. I couldn't help but wonder if the letters were somehow connected to that long-forgotten tragedy. I began to discreetly ask a few older residents about the incident mentioned in the letters. In each conversation, I received the same cautious response, a mixture of denial and whispered acknowledgement, as if the truth was something everyone knew but no one dared to discuss openly. The more I pressed, the more the topic was met with vague recollections and a collective reluctance to name names or dates. It became apparent that whatever had happened was a subject of both fear and sorrow, something that the community preferred to keep buried in the past. Then came a breakthrough that sent a chill down my spine. One quiet evening, as I sat in my study reviewing the letters once more, I noticed an anomaly in one of the pages, a detail that I remembered all too well from a recent event. It was a description of a peculiar mark found on an old door, a phrase that spoke of a specific time in a manner that mirrored an incident I had witnessed just a week before. I immediately compared the handwriting in that letter with the memory of what I had seen on that fateful day, and the resemblance was uncanny. It was as though the past and present had momentarily converged, linking a decades-old mystery with current events in a way that defied explanation. I felt both exhilarated and unnerved. The letters, once a mere collection of disjointed thoughts, now hinted at an ongoing connection, a living thread that tied an old, unsolved crime to something unfolding in the present. I began to document every detail in a small journal, writing down my observations, the whispered conversations I had overheard, and even the subtle changes in my own emotions as I tried to understand the deeper meaning behind the cryptic messages. In the weeks that followed, my nights became filled with restless contemplation. I would lie awake in the quiet hours, the soft hum of a distant city life outside my window, serving as a reminder that I was not alone in this world of secrets. I started rereading the letters under the dim light of my bedside lamp, letting each fragment sink in slowly. The words seemed to speak of loss and regret, of opportunities missed and lives forever altered. There was a recurring lament in them, a sense of desperate hope for redemption that was never fully realized. One particularly quiet night, when the world outside was hushed and my mind was teeming with unanswered questions, I decided to retrace my steps back to the abandoned store. I needed to know if there was anything more to be found, some final piece of the puzzle that I had missed on that first visit. With a mix of apprehension and determination, I made my way through the familiar back alleys, the letters safely tucked away in my bag. The building looked even more forlorn in the muted light of the evening, its details blurred by time. I wandered slowly through its dusty corridors, checking every nook and cranny, hoping to find additional clues. There, behind a fallen shelf, I discovered a small, hidden compartment. Inside lay a bundle of documents, far more disorganized and chaotic than the neat stack of letters I'd found earlier. Among them were what appeared to be old photographs, black and white images of people whose faces were blurred by the passage of time, and a few newspaper clippings with headlines that I could barely decipher. One clipping mentioned a tragedy in the night, without offering any further details, and another hinted at a missing person whose case was never officially closed. I gathered these remnants carefully, aware that they might hold the key to understanding the full scope of the mystery. Returning home with my new findings, I spent long hours cross-referencing the details from the letters, the photographs, and the clippings. I created a timeline in my journal, trying to link the scattered events together into a coherent narrative. But even as I connected the dots, there were glaring gaps, moments where the story seemed to fade into nothingness, leaving me with a lingering sense of incompleteness. It was as if someone had deliberately left parts of the puzzle unsolvable, ensuring that the full truth remained forever hidden. Story number 11, The Uncharted Map. I'll never forget the day I found the map. It was one of those quiet afternoons when the past seems to press gently against the present. I had been wandering an estate sale at an old manor, one of those neglected places where forgotten memories gathered dust, when I discovered a vintage map hidden among relics of a life long past. Its edges were worn, its ink slightly faded, yet every line and symbol pulsed with mystery. There was no title or legend printed along its borders, just a series of enigmatic markings and coordinates that suggested secret locations. I bought it on impulse, unaware that it would lead me on a journey that would forever alter my understanding of history and of myself. Once home, I spread the map out on my kitchen table. I remember the texture of the paper, crinkled like old parchment, and the way the ink caught the light in a warm glow. It wasn't a typical road map. Instead, it depicted various sites around our region in a style that combined both careful cartography and artistic flourish. There were cryptic symbols drawn in the margins and strange annotations in a neat, hurried script. One of the marks, a simple X next to an outline of a derelict building, immediately captured my attention. At first, I assumed it was merely decorative, an odd remnant of someone's personal doodles. But as I compared the symbols with vague references I'd heard in passing, old stories of unsolved mysteries and forgotten scandals, the map began to take on an entirely new meaning. It seemed to hint at secret locations tied to historical events that had been deliberately buried by time. Intrigued, I decided to follow its trail. Over the next several days, I pored over local archives, combed through faded newspapers, and even chatted with a few older residents who recalled obscure events. Each marked spot on the map appeared to correlate with a real, unsolved incident. A burned-down factory rumored to have been the site of an industrial cover-up, a forgotten cemetery that local lore claimed was haunted by the victims of a scandalous betrayal, and a ruined estate where whispers of a long-buried feud had once rocked the community. A journey into shadows. Emboldened by these clues, I set out on a series of mini-expeditions. My first stop was a dilapidated warehouse at the edge of town. One of the spots marked with an X. The building stood isolated among overgrown fields, its walls scarred by time and neglect. I walked slowly around it, my footsteps crunching on gravel and broken glass. There, etched faintly into one of the brick walls, was a symbol that matched one of the map's cryptic notations. I pressed my hand against the cool surface, feeling a shiver of anticipation. It was as if the wall itself remembered something, though the memory was too distant to grasp. At each location, I gathered small fragments, a rusted key, a torn scrap of paper with an illegible date, even an old photograph half hidden under debris. In one forgotten graveyard, I found a stone that bore the initials of a name I'd seen on the map's margin. Each clue deepened the mystery, gradually piecing together an unsolved scandal from decades past. Whispers in the community suggested that the scandal involved a prominent family, a family once revered, now shrouded in secrecy, whose dark deeds had been swept under the rug. I recall one particular night when I ventured to a ruined estate. The structure was nearly swallowed by creeping ivy and shadows, its windows dark like empty eyes. As I wandered through the derelict halls, I found evidence of a hurried exit, a discarded glove here, a broken pendant there. In a dusty study, I uncovered a faded journal page stuck between the cracked walls. The page recounted a brief, heart-wrenching confession. It mentioned betrayal, a final confrontation, and a promise that the truth would remain hidden for fear of the scandal's devastating impact. I felt an overwhelming sorrow and anger, a silent echo of those who had suffered in that long-ago tragedy. The unending puzzle. Yet, every clue I discovered led to more questions. The map itself remained an enigma. The markings, though precise, never revealed the full story. I traced each line with a growing sense of both wonder and dread. Locals I spoke to hesitated when I mentioned the scandal. Some offered only vague nods and guarded glances, as if the past was a forbidden territory best left undisturbed. I began to compile my findings in a worn notebook, detailing each journey and every minor discovery. The map became a sort of living record, a puzzle that stretched out before me, promising that if I could only decipher all its cryptic clues, I might unlock a secret that had been hidden for generations. But as I connected the dots, I realized the truth was far more complex and painful than I'd imagined. The scandal was not merely a tale of greed or betrayal. It was entwined with the very identity of the community, a legacy of secrets that had reshaped lives and left behind a quiet, unending ache. One evening, as I sat in my study, the map spread out before me and the notebook open to my latest observations, I felt the weight of the mystery settle upon me. I remembered a local saying, "Some maps do not lead you to treasure, but to the echoes of old sorrows." In that moment, I understood that the map's true significance wasn't in providing clear answers. It was in the questions it left behind, the lingering enigma that refused to be resolved. Every marked spot, every fragment of evidence, seemed to whisper of a hidden story that might never be fully told. I eventually returned the map to its resting place among my most private possessions, a secret reminder that some mysteries are meant to remain just that. Mysteries. Its true impact lingers like a faded echo, an unresolved piece of our collective past that continues to haunt the present. I share this journey not as a definitive history, but as a personal testament to the enduring power of secrets. Story number 12, The Missing Echo of Memory. I never expected that the past would come calling in whispers. For years, I'd gone about my days, a quiet man with an unremarkable life, until the day the echoes began. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. I would be in the middle of an ordinary conversation, perhaps with a friend, or even while simply reading a book, and then suddenly, as if carried on a breeze from another time, I would hear a voice, a fragment of dialogue that I couldn't place, a sentence that felt both intimate and distant. It was as though the sound of a conversation I'd once had, or perhaps one I'd forgotten entirely, echoed through the corners of my mind. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination playing tricks on me, a stray memory triggered by a familiar scent or a fleeting sound. But as days turned into weeks, these echoes grew more frequent and insistent. They began to intrude on my thoughts at the most unexpected moments. One afternoon, while sitting alone in my modest living room, I heard a snippet of laughter, soft, bittersweet, and achingly familiar. I closed my eyes, trying to place the sound, but all I could feel was a vague ache, as if a part of me had been lost long ago. I started keeping a journal, jotting down the times and circumstances when these echoes emerged. I noted the tone of voice, the cadence of the words, and even the emotions they stirred inside me. Slowly, a picture began to form, a mosaic of fragmented memories that hinted at a past I had long suppressed. There were mentions of names I couldn't recall clearly, moments of joy that had been mixed with unspeakable sorrow, and even the faintest outlines of a conversation about a family tragedy that had been swept under the rug. Yet, every time I tried to piece these fragments together, they slipped away like sand through my fingers. One evening, as dusk was falling, and the world outside grew quiet and introspective, I sat by the window with a cup of tea. I remember feeling unusually tense, almost as if I was waiting for something to happen. And then it came. A full, clear echo of a conversation. I distinctly heard a voice, one that was not mine, reciting words that carried the weight of grief and regret. "We cannot escape the truth, even when we try to forget." The words reverberated in the silence of my room, and for a moment I was overcome by a sense of déjà vu so profound that my heart skipped a beat. I began to suspect that these echoes were not random or illusory at all. They were tied to something deeper, a long suppressed family tragedy that had haunted the corridors of my memory without my conscious awareness. I started digging through old photo albums, dusty boxes of letters, and even faded documents that had been tucked away in a corner of the attic. I recalled vague stories my parents had once hinted at, half-whispered conversations over dinner about a sorrowful event that had forever altered the course of our family. But whenever I asked direct questions, the topic was quickly changed or met with evasive glances. Then, one afternoon, at a small local cafe, I met a stranger who would change everything. I was sitting by myself, lost in thought, when a man approached me. His face was lined with years of quiet wisdom, and his eyes held a depth that seemed to look right through to my soul. In a low, measured voice, he greeted me. "I know what you've been hearing," he said softly. as if the admission had been a burden on his heart for far too long. Taken aback, I invited him to sit down. Over a cup of lukewarm coffee, and in the hushed atmosphere of that nearly empty cafe, he began to recount his own experiences. Like me, he had been haunted by echoes. Faint, recurring voices that replayed conversations from a time he had long tried to forget. As he spoke, he mentioned details that resonated with my own fragmented recollections. A family tragedy cloaked in silence, a secret that had been buried under layers of denial and sorrow. He recalled the day when the voices became unmistakable, when he had heard the unmistakable sound of a woman's anguished plea that seemed to come from the very walls of his childhood home. I listened, spellbound, as he described how the echoes had intensified over time, how they had grown into a constant murmur in his mind, forcing him to confront memories he had long suppressed. He spoke of sleepless nights and the overwhelming weight of a history that refused to be erased. His words stirred something deep inside me, a recognition that went beyond mere empathy. It was as if our fates had been intertwined by a shared, unspoken sorrow. That day, after our conversation, I felt a renewed urgency to uncover the truth behind these persistent echoes. I began to revisit old family haunts, places that I had avoided for years, afraid of the memories they might trigger. I walked the quiet halls of the house where I grew up, ran my fingers over the worn banister, and stared at faded photographs that now seemed to hold hidden messages. Each step, each quiet moment of introspection, brought a surge of emotions that I had long kept at bay. It was as if the echoes were guiding me toward a truth that I had been too frightened to face. One evening, as I sat alone in the dim light of my study, I felt a sudden, overwhelming compulsion to confront the voices directly. I turned on an old tape recorder and began speaking aloud, asking questions into the silence. "Who are you? What do you want me to remember?" For a long time, there was no response, just the soft hum of the machine and the distant sound of a ticking clock. Then, as if answering my plea, I heard it. A clear, resonant echo that said, "Forgive us." The single word sent a chill through my body. It was both a command and a lament, a plea from the past that seemed to carry the weight of generations. The realization hit me hard. These echoes were not just random auditory hallucinations. They were a collective memory of pain, a voice from a tragedy that had been buried deep within my family's history. I began to recall snippets of childhood, the hushed conversations between my parents, the anxious glances exchanged during family gatherings, and the unspoken sadness that seemed to hover in the background of every celebration. I started piecing together the narrative. There had been a terrible loss, a secret so heavy that it had cast a long shadow over our lives. And now, these echoes were demanding that I acknowledge it, that I confront the truth of who we once were and what had been lost. The following weeks were a tumultuous blur of emotion and discovery. I sought out old acquaintances, distant relatives whose faces I remembered only dimly, hoping to glean more about that long-forgotten event. Each conversation was laden with half-truths and guarded statements, as if the very act of remembering was both painful and forbidden. Yet, through these piecemeal recollections, a pattern began to emerge, a story of love, betrayal, and a sacrifice that had been made to keep a secret hidden. The details were scattered and fragmented, but they all pointed to one undeniable truth. The echoes I had been hearing were the voices of those who had suffered, trying desperately to be remembered. Then, one fateful night, I experienced a confrontation that would forever change my understanding of my own history. I was walking home along a quiet, deserted street when I encountered a man standing beneath a flickering street lamp. He seemed to be waiting, almost expectantly, as if he had known I would come. His eyes met mine, and in that brief moment, I felt a surge of recognition, a deep, unspoken understanding that transcended words. He introduced himself simply, and then without preamble, he began to speak of memories that mirrored my own. He recounted conversations, voices, and events that I had only experienced as fleeting echoes in my mind. His tone was gentle, yet laced with sorrow, and as he spoke, I could feel the fragments of my forgotten past aligning with his own recollections. For what felt like hours, we talked, exchanging details that were as personal as they were mysterious. He told me that he, too, had been haunted by these echoes for as long as he could remember, that they had once been a source of pain, but had gradually revealed a hidden truth about his family. His words resonated deeply within me, stirring up long suppressed emotions and forcing me to confront the uncomfortable reality that my identity was intricately bound up with a tragedy I had long avoided. As the conversation unfolded, I realized that our families had been linked by a series of events, a shared secret that had been hidden away, shrouded in silence and regret. The stranger's memories were like shards of a mirror that, when pieced together with my own, began to reflect a picture of betrayal, loss, and ultimately, the desperate yearning for forgiveness. That night, after our conversation, I felt both a profound sorrow and a cautious relief. The echoes, once a source of relentless confusion and anxiety, now took on a different quality. They were a call to remember, a plea for reconciliation with a past that I had been too afraid to confront. I spent the next several nights in quiet contemplation, revisiting the fragments of memory that had surfaced, and slowly allowing myself to piece together the narrative of that long-suppressed tragedy. I wrote down every detail, every whispered recollection, and every emotional response that the echoes stirred within me. As the weeks turned into months, I found that the intensity of the echoes began to wane. They did not vanish entirely, of course. They lingered in quiet moments, like the soft refrain of a song you once knew by heart. But they no longer assaulted me with the same urgency. Instead, they became part of my daily awareness. Story number 13. The Secret in the Family Album. I never thought my family was anything but ordinary. Growing up, I always assumed our stories were the kind passed down over quiet dinners. Tales of love, loss, and the everyday struggles of life. But that all changed the day I discovered an old family album tucked away in a forgotten corner of our attic. It was a lazy afternoon, the kind where time seems to move slowly, and every crevice of an old house whispers its own history. I was searching for boxes to donate, rummaging among the relics of a bygone era, when I came across a battered, leather-bound album. Its cover was worn, and the edges frayed, as though it had been handled with both care and sorrow over many decades. Something about it caught my eye, and I felt compelled to open it. Inside, the album was filled with black and white photographs of relatives I recognized and others I had only heard about in passing. At first glance, the pictures seemed typical. Smiling faces at family gatherings, snapshots of children playing in sunlit backyards, and candid moments at weddings and birthdays. But as I flipped through the pages, I began to notice peculiar details. In the background of several photographs were shadowy figures, faint, unrecognizable shapes that didn't seem to belong. They lingered in the edges of the frames, almost as if they were watching silently. Their presence was subtle, easily dismissed as a trick of the old camera or a smudge on the paper. But the more I looked, the more I became convinced that something was amiss. I spent that evening examining each photograph meticulously. In one image, taken at what appeared to be a family reunion in the late 1960s, a figure in a dark suit hovered near a doorway, its features blurred and indistinct. In another, during a summer picnic by a lake, there was a fleeting glimpse of someone standing behind a group of laughing children. A person whose eyes, if you could catch them, seemed filled with a deep, unspoken sorrow. I couldn't shake the feeling that these weren't random imperfections. They were deliberate hints, fragments of a story that had been hidden away from public view. The mystery deepened when I found a folded, yellowed piece of paper wedged between the pages near the end of the album. Carefully unfolding it, I discovered that it was a diary, a small, leather-bound journal with entries written in a neat but hurried hand. The diary didn't bear a name on its cover, only the faded initials M.E. on the inside front page. The entries dated back several decades, chronicling events that seemed to echo the silent tragedies hinted at in the photographs. As I began to read, the words leapt off the page, each entry steeped in a sense of loss and betrayal. The diary recounted a series of events that no one in our family ever spoke about openly. It told the story of a cherished relative, someone whose memory had been carefully erased from our collective narrative. According to the diary, this person had been at the heart of a scandal that rocked our family, a secret so painful that the truth had been buried under layers of silence and guilt. The entries hinted at a bitter feud, of promises broken and trust betrayed, and of an unspeakable loss that tore the family apart. One passage, in particular, sent a chill through me. It described a night of tumult, a heated confrontation that spiraled into chaos, leaving scars that no amount of time could heal. The writer spoke of whispered accusations and tearful confessions, of a moment when loyalty shattered like glass. The diary mentioned that a hidden photograph, much like those I had seen in the album, had been taken that night. It was a photo that captured more than just an image. It held a secret, a silent witness to the betrayal that had changed our family's course forever. Over the following days, I found myself consumed by the diary's revelations. I began to retrace my family's history, sifting through old letters and talking quietly with relatives whose memories seemed as foggy as the photographs in the album. The more I learned, the more I realized that the unexplained figures in the background of those pictures were not mere accidents of time. They were echoes of a hidden past, a reminder that there was a chapter in our family story that had been deliberately kept from view. I recall one conversation with my aunt, who, after much prodding, reluctantly admitted that there had once been a scandal, a tragedy involving a long-lost love, and an irrevocable betrayal that had left deep emotional wounds. She spoke in halting whispers, as if afraid that the truth might somehow resurrect old ghosts. It became clear that the diary was the voice of someone who had borne the weight of this secret alone. Someone who had felt the sting of betrayal and had recorded every painful detail in the hope that, one day, the truth might set the family free. As I pieced together the fragmented clues, I began to understand that the mysterious figures in the photographs were symbolic. They represented the unacknowledged presences, the family members who had been sidelined, forgotten, or purposefully erased from the narrative. Their ghostly images in the background were like silent accusations, a visual reminder of what had been lost. The diary, with its raw, unfiltered emotions, was a testament to the fact that our family's past was far more complex than anyone had admitted. It was a history marred by love and betrayal, by moments of unspeakable pain that had left a lingering, unsettling legacy. The more I uncovered, the more I felt the weight of the secret. Every time I looked at a photograph or reread a diary entry, I was struck by the realization that the truth was not simply a matter of fact. It was something that had reshaped the very essence of our identity. I began to see the album and the diary as intertwined relics, both telling a story that needed to be acknowledged, even if it meant confronting parts of our past that were best left undisturbed. One evening, as I sat in the quiet of my study with the album open before me and the diary resting in my lap, I felt an overwhelming surge of emotion. It was as though the silence in the room was filled with the voices of those long gone, each echo carrying a message of sorrow and regret. I realized that by uncovering this secret, I had become the keeper of a legacy that was as much about healing as it was about remembering. The truth, though painful, held the key to understanding why our family had always felt like something was missing, and why there was an inexplicable heaviness that had persisted through generations. In the end, the discovery of the family album and the diary did more than just reveal a hidden scandal. It reshaped the narrative of our entire lineage. It forced us to confront a past that had been shrouded in silence, to acknowledge the losses that had defined us, and to reckon with the betrayal that had altered our course. Story number 14. The lurking presence in the library. I've always found solace among the towering shelves of our town library, a quiet sanctuary where every book feels like a portal to another time. For years, I've cherished the hush of whispered pages and the soft murmur of turning paper. But over time, I began to notice something inexplicable, something that unsettled even the most routine days. It started with small disturbances, a misplaced book here, a strange sound in a silent aisle. But soon, whispers of a presence began to spread among the regular patrons. It was a mild afternoon when I first sensed that something was amiss. I was restocking a shelf near the rare books collection, where the air was thick with the musk of aging paper and polished wood. I felt a chill that wasn't due to the drafty windows, and I couldn't shake the impression that I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder and thought I saw a shadow flit across the wall. Too subtle to be an illusion, but too definite to ignore. Over the following weeks, several patrons confided in me that they had experienced similar sensations. A woman whispered of hearing soft, indistinct voices reciting fragments of ancient poetry when she wandered among the manuscripts. A retired teacher mentioned that on particularly quiet mornings, he'd see a faint outline near the rare collections, almost as if someone were guarding the books with a silent, watchful intensity. The accounts varied, but they all pointed to one persistent idea, an unseen presence that lingered in the library's most venerable corners. Intrigued and somewhat unsettled, I began to document these occurrences in my journal. I placed a small recorder discreetly in one of the less frequented alcoves, hoping to capture the elusive sounds that so many had described. For days, I listened to the hum of the air conditioning, the soft creaks of old wooden floors, and the gentle tapping of distant footsteps. Then, late one evening as the library was nearly empty, and the overhead lights cast long, quiet shadows, I heard it, a whisper so soft it might have been mistaken for a draft. It was the sound of a word, or perhaps a fragment of a phrase, that seemed to float on the edge of audibility. I listened intently, heart pounding, as the whisper repeated itself, a murmur that seemed to speak of forgotten stories and ancient secrets. Determined to understand what was happening, I began to observe the library with renewed vigilance. I roamed the stacks after closing time, moving silently among rows of books that had absorbed decades of quiet conversation. There, in a secluded corner behind shelves heavy with rare manuscripts, I felt the presence most acutely. It was not a feeling of malevolence, but one of deep, melancholic guardianship, as if the library itself were alive with memories, protecting the secrets it held within its pages. On one such evening, I decided to record my observations. I sat at a small desk, the glow of a solitary lamp casting soft light over my notes, and waited, At first, nothing happened. Then, after a long, tense pause, I heard the sound again. A clear, almost musical whisper that seemed to emanate from behind a row of leather-bound volumes. I edged closer, my curiosity overcoming my fear, until I could see nothing but rows of books bathed in soft lamplight. The sound grew fainter, then louder, as if it were drawing nearer. I fumbled with my recorder, trying desperately to capture every nuance of the voice. It was as though the very air was charged with an ancient secret, a quiet melody that spoke of love lost and histories unspoken. Later, when I reviewed the recording, I found that it contained not just a whisper, but a series of low, rhythmic sounds, a cadence that echoed with the pulse of long-forgotten chants. I couldn't decipher any clear words, but the feeling it evoked was unmistakable. A blend of sorrow, longing, and a protective resolve. It was then that I began to suspect that the presence was more than a mere trick of acoustics or the product of overactive imagination. It was as if the library itself had a soul, one that was determined to guard its most precious secrets from the world outside. As the weeks passed, the accounts of the spectral guardian grew bolder. One crisp morning, a regular patron, a quiet man with kind eyes, approached me with a tremor in his voice. He recounted how, while perusing a section of antique manuscripts, he had felt an almost tangible force brushing past him, accompanied by a whisper so soft it seemed to speak directly to his heart. He insisted that the presence was benevolent, a silent guardian ensuring that the wisdom of the past was never forgotten. Yet his eyes betrayed a lingering fear, a sense that some secrets were better left undiscovered. That conversation set me on a path of deeper inquiry. I began consulting old records of the library, poring over blueprints and notes from its early days. I learned that the building had been constructed over a century ago, and that many of its rare volumes had been donated by a reclusive scholar who had mysteriously vanished shortly after their donation. Rumors had swirled for decades that his spirit still roamed the stacks, tending to the manuscripts as if his duty to preserve knowledge transcended death itself. One night, driven by both trepidation and an unyielding need for understanding, I stayed late after closing. I walked through the silent corridors until I reached a secluded section near the rare books room. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of old paper and an indefinable melancholy. As I sat down, I could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon me. The recorder lay on the desk, and I took careful notes as the minutes ticked by in a heavy, expectant silence. Then, as the clock neared midnight, I heard it, a clear, resonant whisper, unlike anything I had ever heard before. It wasn't merely a sound. It was as if a presence had spoken directly to me. The whisper was layered, as though multiple voices were speaking in unison. A murmur of a long-forgotten prayer, a plea, or perhaps a warning. I leaned forward, my breath catching in my throat, and strained to make out the words. I could only grasp fragments, words like remembrance, guardian, and sacrifice. The message was incomplete, but its impact was profound. I felt a shiver run down my spine, as if the library itself were mourning a loss that had never been resolved. The lingering enigma. In the days that followed, the mystery of the library's guardian presence remained unresolved. I continued my nightly observations, recording every unusual sound and every inexplicable movement. Other staff members began to report similar experiences, though we never spoke of it openly. Each of us, in our own way, had come to accept that the library held a secret too deep for simple explanations. I found solace in the quiet acceptance that some mysteries are meant to endure, a gentle, persistent reminder that not all truths can be neatly explained or catalogued. The presence, whether the spirit of the long-lost scholar or an embodiment of the library's collective memory, had become an intrinsic part of the building's character. It was there in every creak of the floorboards, every soft whisper among the pages, and every quiet moment of reflection in the dusty alcoves. Story number 15, The Mirror in the Attic. I had always believed that a home held more than just walls and furnishings. It carried the echoes of its past, whispered in the quiet corners where time itself seemed to rest. After months of renovating an old house I'd inherited from distant relatives, I thought I was preparing for a fresh start. Yet, one fateful day, while exploring the newly cleared attic, I uncovered something that would change my understanding of the past and blur the boundaries between memory and mystery. It began as a typical exploration on a warm afternoon. I climbed the narrow, creaking stairs to the attic, a space I had long neglected. Dust motes danced in the slanting light that filtered through a small window, and the air smelled of old paper and forgotten memories. Amid stacks of disused trunks and faded furniture draped in moth-eaten sheets, my hand brushed against a heavy, ornate frame. Tucked away behind a crate of discarded photographs lay an antique mirror, its glass unblemished by time. The frame was a masterwork of craftsmanship, adorned with intricate carvings and strange symbols, runes and figures whose meaning I could not decipher. I remember the first time I looked into that mirror. As I cleared away layers of dust, its reflective surface shone with a strange clarity. At first, I saw only myself, a tired face, etched with the lines of recent renovation stress. But then, as if by a subtle shift in perspective, I caught a fleeting glimpse of another presence, a shadow that did not belong to me. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving me with a chill and a sense of unease. Over the next few days, I began noticing peculiar phenomena. When I passed by the mirror in the attic, I sometimes saw the faint outline of a figure behind me, a woman in an old-fashioned dress, her eyes sorrowful, as though burdened by a secret. Other times, the symbols on the frame seemed to glow dimly, pulsing in a rhythm that matched my own heartbeat. Intrigued and disturbed in equal measure, I decided to delve into the mirror's mysterious origins. I scoured the house for any records, hidden letters, or old diaries that might reveal something about the mirror's provenance. In a forgotten drawer beneath a cracked writing desk, I discovered a fragile envelope containing a single sheet of handwritten notes. The faded script recounted a story of a family long ago, whose lives had been torn apart by betrayal and loss. It spoke of a tragic love affair, of promises broken, and a bitter feud that ended in sorrow. The mirror, it hinted, had been passed down as both a relic and a warning, a silent witness to the scandal that had forever altered the family's destiny. As days turned into restless nights, the mirror's influence grew stronger. I began to experiment, placing it in different rooms to see if its behavior changed with its surroundings. In the living room, it seemed benign, a beautiful antique that lent a touch of old-world charm to the space. But in the solitude of the attic, its aura was unmistakable. I started to record my observations, writing down every odd reflection and every whisper of a sound that might be linked to it. One evening, as I sat alone in the quiet of the attic, I felt compelled to speak aloud. "Who are you? What do you want me to remember?" For several heartbeats, nothing happened. Then, almost imperceptibly, the temperature in the room dropped. In the mirror's reflection, I saw not my own eyes, but the sorrowful gaze of a woman who seemed to be pleading silently, a look of resignation mixed with a desperate hope that her story might finally be told. That night, I dreamed of her. I dreamt of a grand old house much like mine, filled with laughter that turned to weeping, of secret meetings in hidden rooms, and of a betrayal that left scars invisible yet indelible. The dream lingered as I awoke in a cold sweat, the image of her face etched into my mind. I knew then that the mirror was more than an inanimate object. It was a portal to a past that my family had tried to bury, an echo of a tragedy too painful to face. Over the following weeks, I became increasingly obsessed with understanding the mirror's history. I visited local libraries, interviewed elderly neighbors who recalled vague tales of a family scandal, and even consulted with a local historian known for his knowledge of obscure local lore. All the while, the mirror remained in my attic, silently watching, its symbols occasionally catching the light in a way that made them appear almost alive. Each conversation and every piece of found evidence added another layer to the story. A forbidden romance, a bitter rivalry, and a tragic accident that had been hushed up by those who feared the shame it might bring. Yet, even with all these clues, the full truth remained elusive, a puzzle missing its final piece. One particularly quiet night, as I sat by the mirror with only the sound of my own breathing and the distant hum of the city below, I resolved to confront the mystery head-on. I arranged a small makeshift séance, a ritual born not of superstition, but of a desperate need to communicate with the past. I lit a single candle, placed a photograph of my ancestors on a worn table, and with trembling determination asked once more, "Tell me what happened. Reveal the truth of our legacy." For a long suspended moment, the air was still. Then, in the reflective surface, I saw it. The brief, vivid image of that sorrowful woman standing right behind the photograph. I could not see her clearly, but the unmistakable pain in her eyes that mirrored my own hidden grief, told a story of love lost and trust betrayed. It was a moment that shattered the barrier between memory and present. A moment that left me with more questions than answers. In the aftermath, I dedicated myself to preserving the mirror's story. Not as a ghostly curse, but as a part of my own identity. A reminder that the past, no matter how painful, shapes who we become. Story number 16. The Haunting of the Back Alley. In the heart of the city, where the busy streets give way to narrow, forgotten passages, there exists an unassuming back alley that has, over time, earned a reputation among urban explorers as a place of inexplicable disturbances. I first learned about this alley from a friend who frequented offbeat locales, speaking in hushed tones about the strange energy that seemed to permeate its walls. Intrigued by the idea of a hidden narrative in an overlooked corner of the urban landscape, I set out with a small group of like-minded explorers, armed with cameras, recorders, and a hunger for uncovering secrets. We entered the alley on an overcast evening, the city's usual bustle muted as we turned down a narrow passage behind a row of aging brick buildings. The alley was dimly lit by a few flickering streetlights and was lined with layers of graffiti, posters peeling away from walls that had witnessed countless passing years. There was an immediate sense of isolation, a feeling that this was a place where time moved differently, where the echoes of the past still reverberated in the present. At first, our exploration was cautious. We moved slowly, our flashlights scanning the cracked pavement and worn walls for any sign of something out of the ordinary. It wasn't long before we noticed the small details that set this alley apart. Faded graffiti on one wall depicted cryptic symbols and words that no one could decipher, a mix of local slang and archaic script. Near the base of a rusted fire escape, we discovered personal items, a child's toy, a weathered scarf, even an old photograph partially obscured by layers of grime. Each fragment hinted at a story, a life that had once intersected with this hidden space, only to be lost to time and neglect. As we ventured deeper, our cameras began to capture strange phenomena. On one monitor, I saw a fleeting image, a blurred shape that moved just out of the corner of my eye, too deliberate to be a trick of light. Other recordings captured indistinct voices, almost like fragmented whispers that echoed off the walls. One particularly eerie moment occurred when our recorder picked up what sounded like a muffled conversation, a hushed exchange of words that seemed to come from nowhere, and yet carried the weight of long-held secrets. I remember the chill that ran down my spine as we reached the far end of the alley, where the walls were thickest with layers of graffiti and old, peeling posters. There, among the chaos of art and neglect, we found evidence that hinted at a personal tragedy. Faded inscriptions on a crumbling wall mentioned a name, one that, though now unrecognizable, seemed to tie the past to the present. Scattered around were personal belongings, a lone glove, a discarded diary with torn pages, and cryptic scribblings that alluded to an event of deep sorrow and unresolved loss. It felt as though the alley was a repository for forgotten stories, each mark a silent testament to lives that had been shattered by events that the community had chosen not to remember. One night, determined to document the phenomenon more thoroughly, I returned to the alley alone. The city was quieter then, the usual cacophony reduced to a soft murmur. I set up my equipment in a spot that had already proven to be the epicenter of strange occurrences. Sitting in the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, I waited. The stillness of the night was punctuated only by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional drip of water from a leaky gutter. Then, as if on cue, the air around me seemed to vibrate with a subtle energy. My recorder picked up a series of soft, fragmented voices, an unintelligible conversation that grew in intensity, then faded, leaving behind a resonant silence that felt heavy with unspoken grief. As I roamed the alley with my camera in hand, I encountered what might be described as a guardian of the past. In a narrow recess between two buildings, my lens caught a fleeting glimpse of a face, partly obscured, almost spectral in its clarity. The eyes, luminous for just an instant, held a profound sadness that transcended time. It was as though the very essence of the alley had manifested in that single, fleeting moment, a silent witness to a tragedy that had been etched into its very walls. In the days that followed, the footage and recordings became a source of quiet obsession. I meticulously reviewed every clip, every soundbite, trying to piece together the hidden narrative. The images and voices were fragmented, each offering only a glimpse of a larger, unresolved story. A local scandal, perhaps, or a personal loss that had left its mark on this neglected corridor. I spoke with a few residents, those who lived nearby, and each conversation was laced with vague recollections and hushed warnings. They mentioned that the alley had been the site of an incident that had forever altered the community, a tragedy so delicate and painful that it was never openly discussed, leaving only rumors and half-remembered details. One elderly man recounted, with a trembling voice, that years ago a close friend of his had disappeared under mysterious circumstances in that very alley. Another spoke of a time when desperate lovers had met in secret there, only for their union to end in heartbreak and violence. Each account added another layer to the tapestry of mystery, yet none offered a complete picture. Over time, I began to accept that the alley's true past might forever remain shrouded in ambiguity. It was as if the very nature of that hidden space was to guard its secrets, offering only fleeting hints and leaving the rest to the imagination. I compiled my findings in a worn leather journal, documenting every observation, every whispered voice, every shadow that flickered in the periphery of my vision. The diary itself became a companion, a silent record of my quest to understand what lay hidden in the darkened recesses of the city. Story number 17, The Unlabeled Artifact. I'd always been drawn to the quiet corners of history, the overlooked relics that seemed to hold more than their surface might suggest. I remember the day I first encountered it, as if it were a summons from a forgotten past. I had visited the local museum, a modest establishment that prided itself on preserving regional artifacts, seeking a momentary escape from the mundane. I wandered through halls filled with meticulously labeled treasures, each story neatly printed on a plaque. That is, until I reached an isolated alcove in a corner of the museum, where an object, utterly unlabeled and shrouded in mystery, sat in a dusty display case. It was an unassuming artifact, a small, intricately designed object made of tarnished metal and dark, aged wood. Its surface was etched with cryptic symbols, swirls and interlocking shapes that I could not readily decipher. There was no title, no provenance, nothing to guide the curious mind. I found myself transfixed by its quiet presence. While other visitors moved past without a second glance, I lingered. I remember running my fingers over the cool glass of the case as if to feel the pulse of history behind it, and in that moment I felt a tug, a silent beckoning to learn more about what had been forgotten. After leaving the museum that day, I couldn't shake the image of the artifact from my thoughts. I returned several times, each visit stirring in me a deeper need to unravel its secrets. Conversations with the museum curators were evasive. "We don't have records on this piece," one staff member told me, his eyes shifting nervously as if he knew more than he was letting on. In hushed tones among the staff, I overheard suggestions that the artifact might be linked to an unsolved historical incident, a scandal, or a mysterious disappearance that had left its mark on the local community. That notion only deepened my obsession. I began my own investigation. I spent long evenings at the municipal archive, scouring faded newspapers and brittle pamphlets, piecing together fragments of stories from decades past. I discovered snippets of an old scandal. A prominent local figure had vanished under mysterious circumstances during a turbulent period, and whispers in the community hinted at a cover-up that spanned families and institutions. There were scattered references to an object of significance that had been recovered from the scene. A personal belonging, perhaps, imbued with a symbolic weight far beyond its apparent value. One afternoon, I sat in a cramped reading room at the local library, my notebook open and pen in hand, when an elderly gentleman approached me. His eyes, clouded with time, yet keen with recollection, regarded me with a mixture of caution and pity. "I've heard that you're asking about the unlabeled piece," he said in a soft, deliberate tone. "There's an old tale among those of us who remember, about a disappearance that rocked our town. They say the missing person was someone of great honor, but also of deep secret. When the incident occurred, there were whispers that an item was taken from the scene, something that belonged to them. I'm not sure if this is it, but it sure stirs memories." His words, laden with both sorrow and mystery, sent shivers down my spine. Over the following months, I followed every lead. I interviewed retired museum staff, local historians, even a few residents whose families had been part of the old social fabric. In one particularly evocative interview, a middle-aged woman recalled her grandmother's account of that fateful night. "They said that the person disappeared after a heated argument," she whispered, eyes darting nervously as if afraid of being overheard. "And the artifact was found later, hidden away, as if someone didn't want its story told." Though her recollections were fragmented, the emotional intensity was undeniable. Each new testimony added another layer to the mystery, yet the artifact's true origin remained elusive. At home, I began to examine the artifact in every possible light. I photographed it from every angle, slowly zooming in on the carved symbols and worn edges. One evening, after hours of meticulous study, I noticed a pattern. Tiny, almost imperceptible markings that looked like a date, or perhaps a set of initials, carved into the underside of a decorative flourish. I took the artifact to a local expert in ancient symbols, a quiet man with a deep knowledge of regional art and semiotics. He studied it carefully, murmuring to himself as he traced his fingers over the intricate designs. "These symbols," he eventually said, "are reminiscent of those used during a period of intense social upheaval in our area. They were often employed to signify loyalty or a pledge of secrecy. It's as if this object was meant to carry a message, a silent witness to something that was meant to remain hidden." His words, while enlightening, only deepened the enigma. One cold winter evening, as I sat by the fire at home with my research spread out before me, I decided to compile all the pieces of evidence. The artifact, the testimonies, the faded articles, all of them began to converge on one unsolved incident, a scandal that had left a respected figure missing and had fractured a community. The more I reviewed the evidence, the more it seemed that this object was a remnant of that dark chapter. I felt as though I were holding a piece of a broken mirror, one fragment that reflected a history too painful to face in full. Yet, despite my efforts, every new discovery only led to more questions. The artifact itself, with its silent symbols and unyielding mystery, remained stubbornly ambiguous. Late one night, I returned to the museum alone, determined to see the artifact in the dim light of its original display. The corridors were quiet, and the air was heavy with the scent of aged wood and history. Standing before the case, I felt a profound sense of connection, as if the object were silently urging me to remember something that had been lost. In that solitary moment, I realized that the true significance of the artifact might never be fully uncovered. Instead, it would remain an enduring enigma, a symbol of the unsolved mysteries that haunt our collective past. Story number 18, The Unsent Letter. I wasn't looking for a mystery that day. I had wandered into the cramped aisles of a second-hand bookstore on a quiet afternoon. One of those little shops tucked away in an unassuming side street, filled with the scent of aging paper and whispered stories of bygone eras. I'd always enjoyed the comforting rustle of pages and the chance to lose myself among forgotten tomes. But on this particular day, as I was browsing through a neglected section of old memorabilia, something unusual caught my eye. Between a battered copy of a local history and a stack of yellowed postcards, I discovered an envelope unlike any other. It was thick and heavy, its edges slightly frayed with time, and there was no postage stamp on it. The handwriting on the front was elegant yet hurried, the address left blank, as if the sender had never intended for it to be mailed. I felt a sudden shiver of anticipation. How many secrets had this silent missive held all these years? Curiosity overcame me, and I took the letter home that very evening. Alone in the dim light of my study, I carefully opened it, as though I were about to unlock a long-forgotten secret. The paper inside was fragile, the ink faded in parts but still legible. The contents were raw, a confession laced with remorse, regret, and the haunting sorrow of a personal tragedy. The writer spoke in a voice that seemed to echo from a past life, revealing details of an event that had rocked a small community decades ago. The letter described a night filled with grief and scandal, where something terrible had occurred. A betrayal so deep that it shattered the fabric of a family, and, by extension, the trust of an entire town. There were no names, only references to the respected one and the one who was lost. The tone was confessional, as if the writer had poured out their soul on paper in a moment of unbearable anguish. Each sentence hinted at layers of hidden stories, of secret meetings in shadowed corners, of whispers in hushed tones, and of a scandal that had been deliberately buried beneath years of silence. As I read on, I found my heart pounding in time with the cadence of the writer's revelations. The letter mentioned a series of events, a local tragedy involving a respected figure who had once been the pillar of our community. There were hints of a relationship gone awry, promises broken, and a betrayal that led to an unspeakable loss. The confessor described the night of the incident in fragmented detail, a storm of emotions, a confrontation that spiraled out of control, and the lingering pain that had haunted everyone involved. And then, abruptly, the letter ended, without a final signature, as if the writer had been forced to stop before they could reveal the full truth. I couldn't shake the feeling that this letter was more than just a relic of a forgotten scandal. It was a key, a clue left behind for someone to eventually piece together a story that had been locked away for far too long. Driven by an unrelenting need to know more, I began to follow the breadcrumbs that the letter had scattered. I combed through local archives, visited quiet corners of the town's neglected historical society, and even spoke with a few elderly residents who remembered murmurs of that scandal, though none dared speak its name openly. The deeper I delved, the more elusive the truth became. Every lead I followed seemed to vanish like smoke. Some recalled vague rumors of a once revered community leader whose public facade concealed a dark, personal secret, a scandal that had been hushed up by those in power. Others mentioned a family torn apart by grief, a legacy of betrayal that lingered in every whispered conversation at local gatherings. But none of these accounts provided a clear answer, only fragments that matched the raw emotions captured in the unsent letter. One chilly evening, after months of searching through dusty records and faded memories, I met a woman who claimed to have known the writer. We sat together in a quiet, out-of-the-way cafe, its walls adorned with sepia-toned photographs of a town that looked both familiar and hauntingly distant. In hushed tones, she spoke of a time when families gathered for community celebrations, when trust was taken for granted, and when a single act of betrayal could undo a lifetime of goodwill. According to her, the letter was written by someone who had been part of that very circle, someone who had witnessed the unraveling of a carefully constructed life. She recalled a scandal that had been swept under the rug, one that had forever altered the family's name and left a stain on the collective memory of the town. Her words resonated deeply with me. It became clear that the unsent letter was not just a personal confession. It was a testament to a legacy of secrets, a ripple in the fabric of our community's history that continued to affect people long after the event. Story number 19. The Invisible Photographer. I had always seen the world through a lens, capturing fleeting moments that most people overlooked. The soft glow of a street lamp on rain-soaked pavement, the quiet dignity of an old building in the midst of urban chaos, the small, intimate gestures that define everyday life. As a street photographer, my camera was my constant companion, a tool that helped me peel back the layers of reality to reveal hidden truths. But nothing in my years behind the viewfinder had prepared me for what would soon transform my work into something inexplicably otherworldly. It began on an ordinary afternoon. I was wandering the city, camera slung over my shoulder, exploring the vibrant interplay of light and shadow on bustling streets. My usual subjects, smiling faces, playful reflections, the everyday hustle, filled my frames. Later that day, as I reviewed the digital images on my camera, I noticed something peculiar in one of my shots taken in a busy urban square. In the background, where there should have been nothing more than a blur of passing pedestrians, a faint figure stood still. It was subtle, barely noticeable at first, but something about the image made my heart skip a beat. I dismissed it as a trick of light or a random anomaly, but the seed of curiosity had been planted. In the days that followed, I began to notice a pattern. Every time I captured a scene, there was a recurring, ghost-like presence, an indistinct figure that seemed to hover at the periphery of my compositions. It appeared in different locations: behind a vendor at a street market, along a quiet alleyway bathed in the soft glow of neon, and even in the reflection of a rain puddle on a busy avenue. The figure was never fully defined, a mere silhouette that shifted and disappeared when I tried to focus on it. At first, I thought it was a malfunction with my camera, or a coincidence born of my creative perspective. But as the images piled up, a disquieting realization took hold. These were not random aberrations, but something else entirely. Intrigued and a little unnerved, I began to conduct a focused investigation. I started by revisiting the locations where the apparitions had appeared. One spot in particular, a narrow cobblestone street near an old, crumbling memorial, seemed to be a recurring stage for these spectral images. I set up my camera and tripod there for hours, capturing every moment as the light shifted and the city moved around me. During one long, silent evening, as fog rolled in from the river and the streetlights cast a diffuse glow, my camera finally caught a clear, almost tangible image of the ghostly figure. It was as if the spirit of a long-forgotten soul had been momentarily captured, a face partially illuminated, eyes that held a deep, unspoken sorrow, and clothing that seemed to belong to an era long past. I was compelled to dig deeper. I spent nights in the archives of local libraries, sifting through old newspapers and municipal records. I discovered murmurs of a historical tragedy, a disaster that had claimed many lives and left behind a legacy of grief and unresolved loss. Rumors had circulated for years about a catastrophic event, a local disaster so profound that its echoes continued to haunt the community. Some accounts mentioned that the victims' memories had been honored with a memorial, while others whispered of a series of unexplained incidents that followed in the wake of that tragedy. The more I read, the more I began to suspect that the spectral figure in my photographs was connected to this dark chapter of history, a ghostly remnant of those who had perished, seeking recognition in the present. Determined to get to the heart of the mystery, I began interviewing local residents. I spoke with an elderly man who had once worked at a now-defunct factory near the memorial. His voice trembled as he recounted stories of a terrible fire that had swept through the area decades ago. A fire that had claimed the lives of many, leaving a scar on the community that was never fully healed. They say that on certain nights, if you look closely, he whispered, you can see them, the faces of those lost, as if they're trying to tell you their story. His words resonated with me, stirring up an emotion I hadn't expected. A mix of empathy, curiosity, and a deep-seated need to honor the past. One crisp evening, armed with my camera and a notebook, I returned to the memorial, a somber place surrounded by overgrown grass and faded monuments. The sky was a canvas of deep blues and grays as twilight descended, and I set up my equipment in a quiet corner of the site. I waited in silence, the only sounds the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant hum of the city. Then, as if on cue, my camera captured the spectral figure once more. This time the image was even clearer, a delicate, translucent form that seemed to drift across the frame, its presence both mournful and enigmatic. I felt as if I were witnessing a moment out of time, a connection between the present and a tragedy that had long been consigned to memory. As the weeks passed, my work began to attract attention. Fellow photographers and local bloggers reached out, sharing their own accounts of inexplicable images and ghostly apparitions. A small group of enthusiasts formed around the phenomenon, discussing theories and poring over our collective evidence. Some argued that these were simply reflections of a creative mind, a quirk of exposure and shadow. Others believed that the spectral images were a deliberate message, a call to remember a history that the city had tried so hard to bury. In late-night gatherings at small cafes, We exchanged ideas and speculated on the nature of the apparitions. One recurring theme emerged. The ghostly figure appeared to be a silent witness to a local disaster, a tragic event whose full details had been lost to time, but whose echoes continued to surface in the most unexpected moments. I began compiling my photographs, interviews, and archival research into a comprehensive project, a modern chronicle of the invisible, a testament to the enduring power of memory and the unexplained. I organized an exhibition in a modest gallery space where I displayed large prints of the spectral images alongside handwritten notes and archival clippings. Visitors wandered through the exhibit in contemplative silence, many lingering before the images as if they, too, sensed the weight of history captured in those elusive figures. Despite the mounting evidence and the passionate discussions, the phenomenon remained shrouded in ambiguity. I never did determine with absolute certainty whether the apparitions were remnants of a past disaster or something more personal, a manifestation of collective grief that had taken on a life of its own. Every new image and every whispered account deepened the mystery, transforming my work into an ongoing urban enigma that defied easy explanation. Story number 20. The Enigmatic Testimony. I spent nearly half my career chasing down leads, following trails of evidence, and wrestling with the dark complexities of human nature. Even in retirement, the ghost of one cold case continued to haunt my thoughts, a case that had unsettled me deeply and, despite every effort, remained shrouded in unresolved injustice. I had once believed that closure was attainable, that the truth would eventually triumph over silence. But as the years passed, I found that some mysteries stubbornly resist resolution, echoing with conflicting testimonies and hidden truths that only grow more unsettling with time. It all began on an overcast morning, when an unexpected package arrived at my modest home. I was retired now, a quiet existence marked by routine and reflection, when I found a battered envelope lying on my doorstep. There was no return address, only my name scrawled in an unfamiliar hand. Inside, I discovered a collection of documents, faded photographs, handwritten notes, and transcripts of interviews long forgotten by those involved. These papers pertained to a cold case from decades ago, one that had, at its time, shattered lives and left a permanent scar on the community. I remember the shock that seized me as I began reading. The documents painted a picture of a tragic night, a violent confrontation, a desperate flight into darkness, and the sudden disappearance of a person whose loss had echoed through the years. In my early days on the force, I had been assigned to investigate that case. I recalled the chaos, the conflicting witness statements, and the overwhelming sense of injustice that permeated every aspect of the investigation. At the time, the case had been plagued by inconsistencies. One witness would insist they saw a man in a dark coat fleeing the scene, while another swore it was a woman with tear-streaked eyes. The evidence was a tangle of half-truths and hushed whispers. The package I received reignited old memories and forced me to confront the past. I spent countless hours poring over the re-examined evidence, revisiting the scene of the crime in my mind's eye. I recalled how, in the months following the incident, there had been persistent rumors linking the case to a respected community figure, a pillar of the neighborhood whose public persona was unblemished by scandal. That revelation had been too shocking to fully pursue at the time, and the trail had grown cold, leaving behind a legacy of unanswered questions and quiet remorse. Determined to find the truth, I began to retrace my steps. I revisited old files stored in dusty archives, re-interviewed a few surviving witnesses whose voices now trembled with the weight of their recollections, and even contacted some former colleagues who had been part of the original investigation. Each new conversation was a mixture of guarded responses and conflicting details. One retired officer, his face lined with years of regret, confessed that he had always suspected a cover-up, but he could never bring himself to name names. Another witness, a woman who had once been at the scene, recalled a fleeting detail that sent a chill down my spine. The sound of a clock striking midnight, as if marking the precise moment when everything went irrevocably wrong. In one particularly haunting encounter, I met with a man who had once been a close associate of the victim. In a small, dimly lit diner off a quiet side street, he spoke in a low, anguished voice. "I remember that night," he said, staring into a cup of cold coffee. There was something off. The way people acted, the silence after the chaos, it was as if everyone was hiding something. And then there was that figure. I can't shake the image of that person standing at the edge, watching it all unfold. His eyes, haunted and distant, made it clear that the memories were a painful burden he'd carried for years. As I continued to piece together the fragmented testimonies, a shocking pattern began to emerge. New evidence, uncovered by a local journalist years after the case had gone cold, hinted at a connection between the incident and the esteemed community figure I'd long suspected. A series of old photographs and confidential memos, scattered among the documents in the package, suggested that this individual had been in the vicinity on the night in question. More disturbingly, one handwritten note mentioned a secret meeting between the community figure and one of the key witnesses, a meeting that had taken place in the dead of night and was never officially reported. The implications were staggering. The very person the town had trusted implicitly might have been involved in the cover-up, manipulating testimonies to conceal a deeper, more insidious truth. I felt an overwhelming mix of sorrow, anger, and disbelief. The case, which had once been just another assignment in a long line of investigations, now loomed before me as a haunting reminder of how justice can be compromised by loyalty, reputation, and the unyielding weight of societal expectations. I revisited the old crime scene, a modest house on a quiet street that seemed to hold its breath as if mourning the events that had transpired there. Every step I took was laden with the ghosts of what had been lost. I could almost hear the echoes of the fateful night. A door slammed in haste, a whispered argument carried away by the wind, and a silent promise that justice would one day prevail. Night after night, I pored over every scrap of evidence in my study. I marked timelines, drew connections between the conflicting testimonies, and re-examined the minutest details that might have been overlooked. The breakthrough, when it came, was as unexpected as it was devastating. In a faded envelope hidden among a box of old photographs at the local archive, I found a document that directly implicated the respected figure. A letter written by an anonymous informant, warning that the community leader had orchestrated the cover-up to protect his own reputation at the expense of truth and justice. The letter was brief, its ink smudged by time, but its message was clear. It stated that the respected figure had used his influence to silence dissent, to ensure that the real events of that tragic night would never be fully revealed. The discovery shook me to my core. Here was the key to a mystery that had haunted me for decades, a confirmation of what I had long suspected but had been unable to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt. Yet, even as I absorbed this revelation, the case remained officially unsolved. The files were closed, the records sealed, and the community had moved on, unwilling or unable to confront the uncomfortable truth. The injustice of it all lingered like a bitter aftertaste, a haunting legacy that continued to resonate with every whispered conversation, every look of regret, and every unresolved question. Story number 21. The Mysterious Farewell. I remember the day I first heard it. A voice in the crowd at the transit station that cut through the daily clamor like a whispered secret. It was a busy morning when I stepped onto the platform, balancing a mug of coffee and my thoughts, when a series of soft, measured words emerged unexpectedly from the old PA system. At first, I thought it was just another routine announcement, but these words were different. Sincere, almost heartbreaking farewells that spoke of a personal loss beyond ordinary commutes. Over the next few days, I found myself returning to that station with a restless curiosity. Between the sound of rolling suitcases and the constant murmur of voices, the announcements would occasionally break through, a voice saying, "Goodbye, my love, until we meet again," or "Farewell, darling, I'll keep our memories alive." Each message, delivered in a tone that was at once intimate and sorrowful, carried details that seemed too personal to be part of a routine schedule. They mentioned moments, places, even names that stirred echoes of a long-forgotten past. Intrigued, I began to record these messages. On a chilly morning with a drizzle that barely muted the urban bustle, I sat on a cold metal bench and activated my portable recorder. The PA system, with its slightly warped sound and static-laden edges, broadcast yet another farewell. This time the message was longer, a soft, melancholic narrative that recounted a parting that had left an indelible scar on its speaker. "I leave you now, beneath a sky heavy with regret," it intoned, the voice trembling with an emotion that made my heart tighten. I played the recording repeatedly, trying to catch every nuance, every hesitated pause, and every tremor that might hint at a hidden story. My curiosity quickly evolved into a personal investigation. I began to frequent the transit station, arriving at different hours and observing the ebb and flow of commuters. I discovered that the farewells were not isolated. Several regulars confessed to hearing the same messages. An older gentleman who sat near the station's corner every morning told me in a low voice that he recalled similar announcements from years past. "There was a time," he murmured, "when the station itself was a threshold between what was and what might have been. I remember a disappearance, a beloved soul lost on a night much like this. They say that sometimes the past speaks through the speakers." His eyes, distant and clouded by memory, lent a gravity to his words that made them impossible to dismiss. Spurred by these testimonies, I turned to the local archives. In a cramped, time-worn municipal library, I scoured through microfiche and faded newspaper clippings. Bit by bit, a pattern emerged. Decades-old records hinted at a tragic disappearance. A young person, once full of promise, who had vanished on a stormy night. Some accounts described a final, desperate goodbye, recorded in the tear-streaked notes of a family member. Other fragments of news reported on a mysterious case that had stirred the community to its core, only to be quietly buried beneath bureaucratic indifference. The archival records were patchy, and the details were elusive. But the emotional core of the story resonated with the sorrow in the farewells I had recorded. One rainy afternoon, I met a retired station manager at a small, cluttered coffee shop near the transit hub. Over steaming cups of bitter coffee, he recounted how, many years ago, the station had been the scene of an unspeakable tragedy. It wasn't just any farewell, he confided. It was the last goodbye of someone cherished by many, a person whose loss rocked this very community. I remember the day vividly. The announcements were not automated but live, and they carried a grief that no one could ignore. Ever since, whispers have said that the echoes of that farewell still linger here. His words, laden with regret and a hint of fear, lent a haunting dimension to the mystery. I could see in his eyes that the memory of that day had never faded. It was etched into the very fabric of the station. Emboldened by these conversations, I delved deeper. I began mapping out the times the messages were broadcast, noting subtle variations in tone and phrasing. Some days, the message was a mere whisper, while on others, it was delivered with a force that suggested urgency and unresolved anguish. I even reached out to a few tech experts to analyze the PA system, but the technology was old and its quirks well known. Nothing could account for the emotional depth of the announcements. It was as if a voice from the past had found its way into the modern system, bridging a gap between then and now. One evening, as dusk settled and the station's fluorescent lights flickered with an otherworldly glow, I found myself alone on the platform. The usual buzz of commuters had subsided, leaving behind an eerie quiet punctuated by the occasional rumble of an approaching train. I sat, wrapped in a threadbare coat, and listened. At precisely 7:43 p.m., a time I had noted from previous recordings, the PA system crackled to life. "Farewell, my dearest," it began, the voice softer than ever, almost fragile in its emotion. This time the message was accompanied by a faint background murmur, like the rustle of a long-forgotten crowd. I closed my eyes, letting the words wash over me, each syllable a bitter-sweet reminder of a past that refused to be forgotten. In that moment, a vision seemed to materialize before me. A flash of light, a shadow crossing the platform, and a feeling that I was not merely an observer, but a participant in an unfolding drama that stretched back through the years. The farewell was not just an announcement. It was a message, a cry for closure from a soul who had been lost to time. I felt a chill that went beyond the cool air of the evening, a deep, visceral shudder that connected me to the sorrow of a forgotten departure. Days turned into weeks as I continued my vigil. I interviewed more commuters, some of whom had begun to share their own encounters with the PA's mysterious messages. A young woman, tears glistening in her eyes, recalled hearing a farewell message on the day her own father had unexpectedly disappeared, leaving her with unanswered questions and a lifetime of quiet grief. An older man spoke of a recurring phrase that, to his ears, evoked the memory of a beloved neighbor who had passed away under tragic circumstances. These personal recollections wove themselves into a tapestry of loss, a collective memory of a community that had suffered deeply and quietly. The more I learned, the more the mystery deepened. I began to wonder if these broadcasts were more than mere coincidences, a mere quirk of outdated technology. I became convinced that they were a living echo, a channel through which the past communicated its unresolved sorrow to those still wandering the present. I even experimented with recording my own observations over several nights, trying to capture not just the voice, but the ambient sounds. A soft wind, the distant hum of conversations, the rhythmic clatter of footsteps that might reveal hidden layers of the farewell's context. One particular night remains etched in my memory. It was late, nearly midnight, and the platform was bathed in a spectral glow from the overhead lights. I sat on a cold bench, the quiet broken only by the occasional distant call of a train conductor. Suddenly, the PA system sprang to life with an intensity that made my pulse race. This message was longer and more detailed than any I had heard before. The voice spoke of a long journey, of parting with a deep love, and of a promise to meet again in a realm beyond this life. I could hear a slight quiver in the voice, a mixture of resignation and hope that transformed the simple words into a poignant farewell. As the final words faded into the night, a heavy silence fell over the platform, and for a moment I felt as if the entire station was holding its breath in shared grief. Though I never uncovered a definitive source for the messages, I realized that their true power lay in their mystery. The farewells continued to be broadcast sporadically over the coming months, each one a delicate blend of nostalgia, regret, and an almost ethereal longing. They became a subject of quiet speculation among the regular commuters, an urban legend whispered in the corridors of the station. I often find myself returning to that quiet platform, listening intently for the soft, soulful voice that seems to speak from another time. A timeless farewell that reminds us that some departures never truly end. Story number 22. The Forgotten Passage. Renovating an old building can often feel like unraveling layers of time. Each creaking floorboard and hidden corner a relic of lives lived and secrets kept. I had taken on the task of restoring a century-old structure in a quiet part of town, a project that promised both challenge and discovery. The building, once a community hub in its heyday, had been abandoned for years, its walls steeped in silent memories. I never imagined that the renovation would lead me to uncover a hidden passage, a secret corridor concealed behind a misplaced bookshelf that would reveal a chapter of the building's dark past. It started on an ordinary afternoon. I was rearranging some old books in what had been the building's library, a room filled with dusty tomes and faded portraits. The bookshelf, slightly askew from years of neglect, caught my eye. There was something odd about it, an unusual gap behind it that I hadn't noticed before. With a mix of curiosity and trepidation, I shifted the shelf aside, revealing a narrow opening that led into a hidden passageway. The air that escaped was cool and musty, carrying the faint scent of old wood and something else, something unidentifiably melancholic. I ventured into the passage with my flashlight in hand, each step echoing softly on the stone floor. The corridor was narrow, its walls lined with layers of peeling wallpaper and remnants of old paint. As I moved deeper, I discovered relics scattered along the floor. A child's toy, a faded photograph in a cracked frame, and even a tattered piece of fabric that looked like part of an old garment. These personal effects hinted at a tragic disappearance, an event that had been all but erased from public memory. The passage itself seemed frozen in time, as if it had been sealed off deliberately to hide what lay within. My initial excitement quickly turned into a profound sense of unease. There was a lingering sorrow in the silence, as though the corridor held the echoes of a long-forgotten tragedy. I began to document my findings, taking photos and jotting down notes about every detail, from the scrawled initials on a rusted metal box to the cryptic markings on the wall that might have once been a sign or a message. The deeper I explored, the more I sensed that this hidden passage was not a mere architectural oddity, but a deliberate concealment, a secret created to hide a scandal or cover up a disappearance that had left a scar on the building's history. Over the next several days, I sought to piece together the puzzle. I visited local archives and interviewed longtime residents who remembered the building's past. In a small, time-worn office at the local historical society, I uncovered old records that spoke of a scandal that had rocked the community decades ago. There were whispers of a respected individual who had vanished under mysterious circumstances, a disappearance so tragic and shrouded in secrecy that the incident had been quietly suppressed. One faded newspaper article mentioned a hidden room in the building, a room where personal belongings and documents were stashed away in haste. The description, though fragmented, bore an uncanny resemblance to the relics I had found in the passage. I recall one particularly harrowing encounter. During a late afternoon interview with a woman who had once worked in the building, she described a memory that sent shivers down my spine. "I remember hearing hushed voices behind that bookshelf," she whispered, her eyes darting nervously as if afraid of being overheard. "There was always something off about that place, a sense of loss, as if someone important had been taken away and never found." Her voice trembled with the weight of unsaid truths, and in that moment I realized that the passage was a tangible remnant of a tragedy that had forever altered the course of lives. Motivated by these accounts, I organized a small team of local investigators to examine the passage more thoroughly. We spent long evenings with flashlights, cameras, and even thermal imaging devices, trying to capture any additional clues. We found more personal items, an old diary with pages that had yellowed with age, delicate jewelry that appeared to be of significant value, and even a small, intricately carved box that, when opened, revealed a collection of faded letters. Each item told a fragment of a story of love lost, of promises broken, and of secrets that had been buried so deep that even time could not erase them. One of the most disturbing pieces of evidence was a series of photographs discovered tucked away in the diary. The images, though blurry and worn, depicted a family gathered in what appeared to be the very room where the passage was hidden. In one photograph, I noticed a figure standing in the doorway of the passage, a shadowy presence whose face was obscured, yet whose posture conveyed profound sorrow. The image, though nearly lost to the ravages of time, spoke volumes. It suggested that the passage had once been a conduit for hidden meetings, perhaps a secret escape route, or a concealed room where illicit plans were hatched. My investigation grew into a full-fledged quest for the truth. I began to reenact the scene with local actors, carefully staging the discovery of the passage to see if I could trigger any residual energy or uncover more clues. I recorded every moment, every whispered remark from the group, and every creak of the old floor. The reenactment did little to clarify the mystery, but it did reveal disturbing contradictions in the official narrative of the building's history. Some accounts spoke of a deliberate cover-up by those in power, a scandal so dark that it had been excised from public records, while others suggested that the disappearance was the result of a personal tragedy, a loss that the family had chosen to hide away rather than face openly. Even as new evidence emerged, the secrets of the passage remained largely undiscovered. The relics I collected and the testimonies I gathered painted a picture of a long-buried scandal, a tragedy that had been swept under the rug to protect reputations and maintain a fragile social order. The passage itself seemed to hold on to its secrets jealously, offering only fragmented glimpses of a past that was too painful to revisit in full. The deeper I delved, the more I felt the weight of the lost lives and untold stories pressing in from every side. And that concludes our chilling accounts. But remember, these stories aren't just fiction. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more terrifying true tales. Sleep tight if you can. Until next time, stay safe in the dark.